Every parent's worst nightmare is watching their child face rejection and cruelty from a world that refuses to see their worth. In 1847, that nightmare was Mary McGraw's daily reality in the unforgiving frontier town of Cedar Ridge. Born blind with a withered left arm, 18-year-old Mary has been turned away by every man seeking a wife. The townspeople whisper that she's damaged goods, unfit for frontier life. Her brother Silas disappeared into the mountains 5 years ago after a violent fight. But now he's returned to find his sister facing a lifetime of loneliness. Silas Grizzly McGraw stands 6'4" with hands that can snap a man's neck. And he's decided no one will hurt his sister again. The town fears him, but they don't know the lengths he'll go to protect Mary's dignity. When every eligible bachelor refuses her hand, Silas makes a shocking decision that will change both their lives forever. But what desperate choice will a mountain man make when society abandons the person he loves most? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley, like a shroud, as Mary McGraw felt her way along the familiar wooden fence that bordered their small homestead. Her fingers traced the rough-hewn posts with practiced ease, each groove and splinter telling her exactly where she stood in relation to the cabin she'd called home for 18 years. The scent of pine and wildflowers filled the crisp mountain air, and she could hear the distant sound of axes biting into timber as Cedar Ridge slowly carved itself from the wilderness. Mary had learned to navigate the world through her other senses with remarkable skill. She could identify a person's approach by the cadence of their footsteps, distinguish between the calls of different birds, and even predict weather changes by the way the wind shifted through the trees. But no amount of adaptation could shield her from the whispered conversations that followed her through town like shadows. "Poor thing," the women would murmur behind gloved hands. "Born cursed, that one." The McGraw blood runs thin. Her withered left arm hung at her side, smaller and weaker than her right, drawing stares and pitying glances wherever she went. In a frontier community where physical strength meant survival, Mary's disabilities marked her as a burden rather than a potential partner. The harsh reality of mountain life left little room for sentiment when choosing a mate. The McGraw family had once been respected in Cedar Ridge. Her father, Thomas McGraw, had been among the first settlers to establish a claim in the valley, building their cabin with his own hands and clearing the land for farming. He'd been a gentleman with weathered hands and a quick smile, teaching both his children to find strength in kindness rather than fear. Their mother, Catherine, had been the town's unofficial midwife, helping bring dozens of babies into the world with skill and compassion. But Thomas and Catherine McGraw had been dead for 3 years now, victims of the fever that swept through the valley one brutal winter. Mary still remembered her father's final words, whispered through cracked lips as he lay dying, "Take care of your sister, Silas. She's got more strength than folks give her credit for." That was before everything changed, before Silas disappeared into the mountains like a ghost, leaving Mary alone to face a world that saw her as damaged goods. The memory of that terrible night still haunted her dreams. Silas had been 23 then, strong and proud, working as a blacksmith's apprentice and courting Rebecca Thompson, the banker's daughter. He'd been different before the incident, gentler, more civilized, quick to laugh and slow to anger. But when 3 drunk cowboys decided to have some fun at Mary's expense outside the general store, something in Silas had snapped like a dry branch. Mary had been shopping for supplies, guided by Mrs. Henderson, when the men started their cruel game. They'd knocked packages from her hands, pushed her into mud puddles, and called her names that made decent folk look away in shame. She'd endured it all with quiet dignity, as she'd been taught, until one of them grabbed her withered arm and twisted it behind her back. Silas had arrived like a force of nature, his hammer still in his hand from the smithy. The first cowboy never saw the blow coming. Silas's fist connected with his jaw with the sound of splitting wood, dropping him unconscious to the dusty street. The second man reached for his gun, but found himself lifted off the ground by his throat, his feet kicking helplessly in the air. The third turned to run, but Silas caught him with the hammer, the metal head striking just below his knee with a sickening crunch. When the dust settled, one man would never walk properly again. Another would eat nothing but soup for months through his wired jaw, and the third had fled town entirely. Silas stood over them like an avenging angel, blood on his knuckles and murder in his eyes. "Daring anyone else to step forward, touch my sister again," he'd growled, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent street. "And I'll bury what's left of you in the mountains, where nobody will ever find the bones." That weathered hunting knife at his belt had caught the afternoon light like a promise of violence, its worn leather handle speaking of countless hours in the wilderness where different rules applied. Their father had carried that same blade, and his father before him, passing down not just a tool, but a legacy of protecting what mattered most. The town had been split in their reaction. Some understood a brother's need to protect his sister, but others whispered that Silas McGraw had crossed a line, that his violence was excessive and dangerous. Rebecca Thompson's father had forbidden her from seeing him again, claiming he was too unpredictable for civilized society. The sheriff had suggested that perhaps it would be best if Silas found somewhere else to practice his trade. 3 days later, Silas had packed his few belongings into a leather saddlebag, kissed Mary's forehead, and disappeared into the wilderness. He'd left her with enough money to last through the winter and a promise that he'd return when things cooled down. That was 5 years ago. Mary had managed alone, though it hadn't been easy. She'd learned to tend their small garden, preserve food for winter, and maintain the cabin as best she could. Neighbors helped when they could spare the time, but frontier life was hard for everyone, and charity had its limits. She'd grown used to the loneliness, the long evenings with only her thoughts for company, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. But the worst part was watching other young women her age find husbands and start families while she remained invisible. At 18, most frontier women were already married with children on the way. Mary had received exactly 3 proposals in her lifetime, each one more painful than the last. The first had come from Gerald Watson, a widower in his 60s whose wife had died in childbirth. He needed someone to care for his 3 young children and manage his household. His offer had been purely practical, a roof over her head in exchange for domestic services. There would be no pretense of romance or affection, just mutual convenience. Mary had seriously considered it until she overheard Gerald telling his neighbor that a blind wife can't see you coming home drunk, and a crippled one can't run away. The second proposal had come from John Fletcher, a trapper who spent most of his time alone in the mountains. He'd been drunk when he asked, slurring his words and making crude suggestions about what a grateful disabled woman might do for a man willing to take pity on her. Mary had declined as politely as possible, but John had persisted, growing increasingly aggressive until Mrs. Henderson stepped in and sent him on his way. The third and most recent proposal had been the most painful of all. Thomas Whitman was young, handsome, and came from a good family. For a brief, foolish moment, Mary had allowed herself to hope that someone might actually want to marry her for herself, rather than convenience or pity. Thomas had courted her properly, sitting on the porch in the evenings and talking about books and dreams and the future he wanted to build. But Thomas's interest had been a cruel joke, a bet with his friends about whether he could convince the crippled McGraw girl to fall in love with him. She'd discovered the truth when she overheard him laughing with his companions outside the saloon, describing in graphic detail how desperate she'd been for male attention. The formal rejection letter he'd sent the next day had been almost merciful in comparison to the humiliation of learning. She'd been entertainment for bored young, and Mary pushed the painful memory aside and continued her morning walk, her hand trailing along the fence posts that marked the boundary of the life she'd built for herself. She'd grown stronger over the years, more self-reliant, less dependent on others for validation or support. The crude comments and pitying looks still stung, but she'd learned to carry her dignity like armor, protecting the tender parts of her heart from further damage. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her pause, her head tilting to catch the rhythm of the horse's gait. Heavy, steady, confident, not the nervous trot of someone lost or the urgent gallop of someone with news to deliver. This rider knew exactly where he was going and had all the time in the world to get there. Mary's breath caught in her throat as recognition dawned. She knew that particular cadence, had memorized it years ago during countless rides through the mountains on lazy summer afternoons. Her hand tightened on the fence post as the horse came to a stop just beyond the gate, leather creaking as the rider dismounted. "Hello, Mary!" The voice was deeper now, roughened by mountain air and years of solitude, but unmistakably familiar. Silas had come home. She turned toward him slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird. "You're taller," she said softly, then felt foolish for stating something she couldn't possibly see. His laugh was different too, quieter, more careful, as if he'd learned to ration even his amusement. 5 years in the mountains will do that to a man. Or maybe you just forgot how big I was. I didn't forget anything. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, carrying all the hurt and loneliness of his absence. "I've been managing just fine without you. I can see that." His footsteps approached slowly, giving her time to adjust to his presence. "The cabin looks good. Garden's thriving. You've taken good care of the place." Mary lifted her chin, drawing on the strength she'd cultivated during his absence. "I take care of myself now. I don't need protecting anymore." Silas was quiet for a long moment, and she could feel his gaze studying her face, taking inventory of the changes 5 years had wrought. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of sadness that made her chest tighten. "Maybe not. But that doesn't mean you should have to." He moved closer. Close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of leather and pine that had always clung to him, now mixed with something wilder, more elemental. Mountain smoke and animal fur and the sharp, clean scent of snow-fed streams. "I heard about Thomas Whitman," he said quietly. Mary's cheeks burned with embarrassment. "The whole town heard about Thomas Whitman. It was quite entertaining, I'm told. I'm sorry I wasn't here. Would it have mattered?" The question escaped before she could stop it, carrying all her accumulated pain and frustration. "Would you have beaten him senseless like those cowboys? Driven him out of town? That worked so well the last time." Silas absorbed her words without flinching, accepting the sharp edge of her anger like a man who knew he deserved it. "Maybe not, but you wouldn't have faced it alone." The simple sincerity in his voice almost undid her carefully constructed composure. She'd spent 5 years building walls around her heart, learning to depend only on herself, and he was threatening to tear them down with nothing more than his presence. "Why did you come back?" she asked. "Because I made a promise to our father, and because I've spent 5 years thinking about the sister I left behind." His hand touched her shoulder gently, and she could feel the calluses that spoke of hard labor and harder living. "I came back to take care of you, Mary, the way I should have been doing all along." Mary felt tears prick at her eyes and angrily wiped them away. She'd cried enough over the years, for her parents, for her loneliness, for the cruel jokes and casual cruelties that were her daily bread. She wouldn't cry now, not when she'd finally learned to stand on her own. "I told you, I don't need—" "Everyone needs somebody," Silas interrupted gently. "Even mountain men get lonely sometimes." The admission surprised her, vulnerable in a way that didn't match the intimidating presence she remembered. This wasn't the same young man who'd left 5 years ago, in a rage of wounded pride and protective fury. The mountains had changed him, tempered him like heated steel, and she found herself curious about the man he'd become. "Tell me about the mountains," she said instead of arguing further. Silas settled onto the porch steps, and she could hear the wood creak under his weight. "They're beautiful, Mary. Terrible and beautiful at the same time. Rivers so clear you can see the bottom 30 feet down. Peaks that reach so high they seem to touch heaven. Storms that can kill you in minutes if you're not careful. Did you like it? Being alone?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, reflective in a way that reminded her of their father. I liked the honesty of it. Mountains don't lie to you or pretend to be something they're not. If you're strong enough and smart enough, they'll let you live. If not, they'll kill you quickly and cleanly without any malice. There's something to be said for that kind of truth. Mary absorbed this, hearing the unspoken comparison to the false kindness and hidden cruelties of civilized society. But you came back. I came back, he agreed. Because mountains don't love you back, no matter how much you respect them. And family does. The words hung between them like a bridge, offering a way back to the closeness they'd once shared. Mary felt the rigid walls around her heart beginning to crack, letting in dangerous possibilities like hope and trust and the terrible vulnerability of caring again. Things have changed since you left, she said quietly. I know. I stopped by Henderson's store before coming here. Heard all the gossip. His voice hardened slightly. Heard about the proposals and the rejections and the way folks talk about you when they think nobody's listening. It doesn't matter anymore. I've accepted my situation. Have you? The question held a challenge she couldn't quite interpret. Or have you just given up fighting? Before she could answer, the sound of approaching voices drifted across the valley. Mary recognized the distinctive cadence of Mrs. Henderson's speech, accompanied by what sounded like 2 or 3 other women. The unofficial welcoming committee, no doubt, come to satisfy their curiosity about Silas's return and gather material for tonight's gossip. Looks like we're about to have company, Silas observed. His tone carefully neutral, Mary straightened her shoulders, preparing herself for the performance she'd perfected over the years. Polite gratitude for their concern, gentle deflection of their more intrusive questions, and quiet dignity in the face of their barely concealed pity. But something in Silas's presence changed the dynamic, adding an element of danger to what should have been a routine social visit. She could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge, controlled but unmistakable. Silas, she said quietly, urgently, whatever you're thinking, don't. I have to live here after you leave again. Who says I'm leaving? The question caught her off guard, opening up possibilities she hadn't dared to consider. But before she could respond, the visitors had arrived at their gate, and the moment for private conversation was over. Mary, dear, Mrs. Henderson's voice carried false cheer like a banner. We heard your brother was back in town. Thought we'd stop by to welcome him home. Mary felt Silas rise from the steps beside her, his movement fluid and controlled. When he spoke, his voice was polite but distant, holding the same careful neutrality she'd heard in the voices of men who'd learned not to trust easily. Ladies, kinda you to stop by. The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of frontier diplomacy, polite inquiries about his time away, carefully neutral comments about how well Mary had managed alone, and subtle probes for information about his plans. Mary listened to it all with growing awareness of the undercurrents, the way the women's voices tightened when they spoke to Silas, the careful distance they maintained from both siblings. Nothing had changed. If anything, Silas's reputation had grown darker in his absence, fed by speculation and fear, and Mary remained what she'd always been, an object of pity, discussed as if she weren't present, her future a matter for community concern rather than personal choice. But as the visit wore on, Mary became aware of something else, a shift in her own perspective that had nothing to do with the visitors and everything to do with the man sitting beside her. For the first time in years, she wasn't facing the world's judgment alone. Whatever else had changed, whatever complications his return might bring, Silas was here. Her brother was home, and that simple fact changed everything. The rejection letter arrived 3 days after Silas's return, delivered by young Tommy Fletcher with the nervous energy of someone who knew he carried poison. Mary felt the expensive paper between her fingers, recognizing the quality stationery that marked it as coming from the Whitman family. Her heart sank even before Mrs. Henderson began reading the formal words aloud. Miss McGraw, the letter began in Thomas's careful script. After considerable reflection and consultation with my family, I find myself compelled to withdraw my proposal of marriage. Upon mature consideration, I have concluded that your particular circumstances would prove incompatible with the demands of frontier life and the expectations of a proper union. Mary's face burned with humiliation as Mrs. Henderson continued reading, each carefully chosen word designed to sound respectable while delivering maximum cruelty. The letter spoke of practical considerations and familial obligations, and the wisdom of seeking a more suitable arrangement for all parties concerned, but it was the final paragraph that delivered the killing blow. I hope you will understand that this decision stems not from any personal failing on your part, but rather from the simple reality that marriage requires partners capable of fulfilling their respective duties. I wish you well in finding a situation better suited to your limitations. The words hung in the cabin air like smoke from a dying fire. Mary sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, while the women who had gathered to hear the news exchanged meaningful glances. She could feel their mixture of pity and satisfaction, pity for her circumstances, satisfaction at being proved right about the futility of her romantic hopes. "Well," Mrs. Henderson said finally, folding the letter with crisp efficiency, "perhaps it's for the best, dear. Young Thomas was probably too ambitious a match anyway." "Indeed," agreed Mrs. Morrison, "the banker's wife. A girl in your position needs to be realistic about her prospects. There are other possibilities to consider, perhaps as a companion to an elderly widow, or helping with children in exchange for room and board." Mary nodded woodenly. Playing her expected part in this familiar theatre of feminine sympathy, she'd performed this scene before, accepting comfort that felt more like salt in an open wound, pretending gratitude for advice that amounted to suggestions for genteel surrender. "Mr. Watson has been asking after you again," Mrs. Henderson continued with forced brightness. "He's still in need of someone to help with his household. The children have been quite unruly since his wife passed. Or there's always the Morrisons' offer," added Mrs. Cooper. "They could use help in the store, and there's a small room above the stockroom that would serve well enough for a single woman." Single woman. The words settled over Mary like a shroud, defining her future in terms of what she would never be, rather than what she might become. At 18, she was already being measured for the narrow confines of spinsterhood, her life mapped out in careful compromise and quiet resignation. The women continued their discussion, debating the merits of various charitable arrangements as if Mary were a piece of furniture to be placed wherever it might prove most useful. She listened with growing numbness, feeling herself disappearing even as they spoke about her future. It was then that Silas returned from his trip to town. Mary heard his boots on the porch first, the heavy tread that announced his presence like distant thunder. The conversation in the cabin died abruptly as the door opened, and she could feel the sudden tension in the room as 4 respectable women found themselves facing the man they'd spent 5 years describing as a dangerous savage. "Ladies," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying the careful neutrality she was learning to recognize. "Didn't expect to find a gathering. We were just—" Mrs. Henderson began, then faltered as she apparently remembered the letter she still held. "That is, we came to deliver another rejection," Mary said quietly, finding her voice at last. "Thomas Whitman has decided I'm unsuitable for marriage. The ladies were kind enough to discuss my options." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mary could hear the whisper of paper as Mrs. Henderson shifted nervously, the creak of floorboards as the other women adjusted their positions, the steady rhythm of Silas's breathing as he absorbed the situation. "I see," he said finally. "And what options would those be?" Mrs. Morrison cleared her throat delicately. "Well, there are several respectable positions available for a young woman of Mary's. That is, someone in her particular circumstances. Mr. Watson has need of household help, and my husband has mentioned the possibility of—" "You're talking about servitude," Silas interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge that made the women shift uncomfortably. Dress it up however you like, but you're discussing ways for my sister to work for her keep like a hired girl. Now see here, Mrs. Henderson bristled. We're trying to help. A woman has to be practical about these things. Mary can't afford to be particular about what? About being treated with basic human dignity. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mary could feel the dangerous stillness that had settled over her brother. The same controlled tension she remembered from that terrible day 5 years ago. Silas, she said quietly, desperately. They mean well, do they? He moved further into the room, and Mary heard the subtle sounds of the women drawing back, recognizing predator instincts that civilization hadn't quite managed to tame. Because it sounds to me like they're planning to parcel out my sister's life like she's charity goods. Your sister's situation requires practical considerations, Mrs. Cooper said stiffly. Perhaps if you had remained to provide for her, instead of disappearing into the wilderness. Perhaps, Silas agreed, his voice deadly calm. You should worry about your own family's affairs and leave mine to me. The confrontation escalated quickly from there. Mrs. Henderson demanded to know what right Silas had to speak to respectable women in such a manner. Mrs. Morrison questioned whether a man who'd chosen to live like a savage was fit to make decisions for his sister's welfare. Mrs. Cooper suggested that perhaps the sheriff should be informed about threatening behavior toward law-abiding citizens. Through it all, Mary sat frozen in her chair, watching her world tear itself apart around her. The careful balance she'd maintained for 5 years, the polite acceptance, the grateful submission to community judgment, the dignified endurance of her circumstances was crumbling under the force of Silas's protective fury. Get out, he said finally, his voice cutting through their protests like an axe through kindling. Get out of my house and don't come back unless you're invited. Well, I never, Mrs. Henderson sputtered. No, Silas agreed. You never considered that my sister might want something more than your scraps of charity. You never thought she might deserve better than a life of grateful servitude. You never imagined she might have hopes and dreams beyond what you're willing to grant her. The women left in a flurry of righteous indignation, their voices carrying back across the valley as they marched toward town, with enough scandal to fuel conversations for weeks. Mary listened to their retreating footsteps with a mixture of gratitude and terror, knowing that Silas had just burned every bridge she'd spent years carefully building. When the last echo of their voices faded, the cabin fell into crushing silence. Mary sat with her hands folded in her lap, feeling the weight of her brother's presence like a storm about to break. She knew he was studying her, taking inventory of the damage, seeing too much with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. You can't keep doing this, she said finally. Doing what? Fighting my battles for me, driving away everyone who tries to help. She lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of strength she'd cultivated during his absence. I have to live here, Silas. These people are my neighbors, my community. I can't afford to make enemies. They were never your friends. His voice was gentler now, but still carried that undertone of controlled anger. Friends don't discuss your future like your livestock to be traded. Maybe not. But they're all I have. The admission cost her, revealing the loneliness she'd worked so hard to hide. When you disappeared, they were the ones who helped me through the first winter. Mrs. Henderson brought soup when I was sick. Mrs. Morrison let me buy supplies on credit when money was tight. They may not respect me, but they've kept me alive. Silas was quiet for a long moment, and she could hear him moving around the cabin, picking up objects and setting them down with careful precision. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of something she couldn't quite identify. What if I told you there was another way? What do you mean? What if you didn't have to choose between servitude and starvation? What if there was a third option? Mary felt a flutter of something dangerous in her chest. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the memory of what hope used to feel like. What kind of option? The kind that would give you independence, security, A life where nobody could dismiss you as damaged goods or debate your future like you weren't in the room. That's impossible. But even as she said it, Mary found herself leaning forward, drawn by the possibility in his voice. There's no such thing as independence for someone like me. Not in a place like this. Maybe not here, Silas agreed. But there are other places, other ways of living. Mary shook her head, feeling the familiar weight of reality settling back over her shoulders. You're talking about fantasy, Silas. I can't just disappear into the mountains like you did. I need people, civilization, help with basic things. What if you had help? What if you had someone whose only job was protecting you, providing for you, making sure you never had to depend on the charity of people who see you as a burden? There was something in his voice now that made Mary's breath catch in her throat. A careful intensity, a watching quality that suggested they were no longer talking in hypotheticals. What are you saying? Silas was quiet for so long that Mary began to wonder if he'd changed his mind about whatever he'd been about to propose. When he finally spoke, his words fell into the silence like stones, into still water. I'm saying that maybe it's time we stopped letting other people define what's possible for the McGraw family. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving fast. Mary recognized the urgency in their pace, the kind of speed that meant official business or serious trouble. Given the morning's events, she suspected both. Silas, she said quietly, urgently. Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're planning, trust me, he said simply. For once in your life, Mary, trust that someone is going to take care of you the way you deserve. The riders were Sheriff Coleman and his two deputies, along with Thomas Whitman and his father. Mary could identify each man by the sound of his horse, the creak of his leather, the particular way he sat his saddle. It was a skill she'd developed over years of careful observation, learning to read the world through sound and smell and the subtle vibrations that traveled through the ground. They dismounted with the careful precision of men who expected trouble, their boots hitting the packed earth with military rhythm. Mary could feel the tension radiating from Silas like heat from a forge, controlled but unmistakable. "McGraw!" Sheriff Coleman called from beyond the fence. "Need to have a word with you." "Then come have it," Silas replied, his voice carrying the same dangerous calm she remembered from that day 5 years ago. The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. The sheriff, prompted by complaints from the offended ladies and pressure from the Whitman family, had come to deliver a warning about threatening behavior toward respectable citizens. Thomas Whitman had come to demand an apology for the morning's insults. His father had come to suggest that perhaps it would be better for everyone if Silas found somewhere else to practice his particular brand of frontier justice. Silas listened to it all with the patience of a man who'd spent 5 years learning to read weather patterns and animal behavior, waiting for the right moment to act. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and precise. "Let me make sure I understand," he said quietly. "You're here because I objected to people discussing my sister's future like she was a piece of property to be disposed of. You're upset because I suggested she deserves better than a life of grateful servitude. And you want me to apologize for protecting my family's dignity. We want you to understand," Mr. Whitman said stiffly, "that threatening respectable women is not acceptable behavior in a civilized community." "Civilized," Silas repeated thoughtfully. "Is it civilized to humiliate a young woman with cruel rejection letters? Is it civilized to discuss her future like she's not in the room? Is it civilized to treat someone as less than human because they were born different?" The questions hung in the air like an indictment, challenging assumptions that had gone unexamined for years. Mary could feel the shift in atmosphere, the way the accusation forced each man to confront the comfortable cruelties they'd accepted as normal. "Your sister's situation is unfortunate," Sheriff Coleman said carefully. "But that doesn't give you the right to terrorize law-abiding citizens." "Terrorize," Silas mused. "Strong word. What exactly did I do that was so terrifying?" "Ask you to treat my sister with basic human dignity." Suggests she might want something more than your charity. You know what you did, Thomas Whitman snapped. The way you looked at us, the way you spoke. Everyone knows what you're capable of, do they? Silas's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. And what am I capable of, exactly? The question forced an uncomfortable silence, as the men realized they were operating on assumption and reputation rather than actual knowledge. What exactly had Silas done beyond defend his sister and express dissatisfaction with her treatment? It was Mr. Whitman who finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the authority of wealth and social position. We're not here to debate philosophy, McGraw. We're here to tell you that this community won't tolerate threats or violence. If you can't conduct yourself like a civilized man, perhaps you should return to wherever you've been hiding these past 5 years. Perhaps I should, Silas agreed mildly. The question is, what happens to Mary when I go? The question caught them off guard, forcing them to confront the practical implications of their demand. If Silas left again, Mary would be alone and vulnerable, dependent on the charity of people who saw her as a burden. But if he stayed, they'd have to deal with a man who refused to accept their comfortable assumptions about his sister's place in their world. Your sister will be taken care of, Sheriff Coleman said finally. The community looks after its own. The way you looked after her while I was gone? Silas's voice carried an edge of mockery, letting her struggle alone, discussing her future like she was livestock, treating every act of basic kindness like a favor she should be grateful for. We did our best, Mr. Whitman began. Your best, Silas interrupted, was 3 proposals from men who saw her as either a servant, a target for cruel jokes, or a source of amusement. Your best was relegating her to a life of spinsterhood and service at 18 years old. Your best was making her feel grateful for scraps of charity and polite dismissal. Each word hit like a physical blow, stripping away the comfortable justifications that allowed good people to participate in casual cruelty. Mary could feel the men shifting uncomfortably, forced to confront the reality of what their kindness had actually meant for her life. What do you want from us? Sheriff Coleman asked finally. Silas was quiet for a long moment, and Mary could feel him weighing options, calculating possibilities. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of a decision that would change everything. I want you to leave us alone, he said simply. Stop trying to plan my sister's future. Stop treating her like a problem to be solved. Stop pretending your charity is kindness when it's really just a way to feel better about your own cruelty. And if we don't, Thomas Whitman challenged. Silas's laugh was soft and dangerous. Then you'll discover exactly what I'm capable of. The threat hung in the air like smoke, implicit but unmistakable. The men exchanged glances, recognizing that they'd reached the limits of peaceful negotiation. They could push further, escalate the confrontation, but doing so would mean accepting responsibility for whatever followed. In the end, they chose discretion over valor, mounting their horses with careful dignity and riding away with promises of future consequences that fooled no one. Mary listened to their retreating hoofbeats with a mixture of relief and terror, knowing that her brother had just declared war on the only life she'd ever known. When the last echo of their horses faded, Silas came to sit beside her on the porch steps. She could feel the tension slowly draining from him, like water from a broken dam. You realize what you've just done, she said quietly. I've bought us time to consider our options. What options? You've just made enemies of half the town. They'll never accept me now, never help me again. If something happens to you, nothing's going to happen to me. His voice carried absolute certainty. And nothing's going to happen to you either. Not anymore? Mary shook her head, feeling the weight of reality settling over her like a familiar burden. You can't protect me from the whole world. Silas, you can't fight every person who treats me badly, or change the way people think about disability and marriage and— Maybe not, he interrupted gently. But I can make sure you never have to face it alone again. There was something in his voice that made Mary's breath catch, a careful intensity that suggested they were approaching dangerous territory. She could feel him watching her, weighing words, preparing to say something that would change everything between them. The moments stretched between them like a bridge over an impossible chasm, filled with possibilities too shocking to contemplate and too tempting to dismiss. Mary felt her heart begin to race as she realized that her brother was about to propose something that would either save her or damn them both. That evening, as the sun painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Silas approached the townspeople with the careful precision of a man walking through a minefield. Mary could hear him moving around their small property, the sound of his boots on packed earth mixing with the distant murmur of voices as curious neighbors gathered to witness whatever confrontation was brewing. She sat on the porch steps, her fingers wrapped around their mother's worn Bible, finding comfort in the familiar texture of cracked leather and well-thumbed pages. Catherine McGraw had carried this book through 3 pregnancies, 2 miscarriages, and countless frontier hardships, marking significant passages with pressed flowers and handwritten notes that still carried the faint scent of lavender. "Fear not, for I am with you," Mary whispered, reading from one of her mother's favorite verses by touch alone. The familiar words had sustained their family through Thomas's death, through the fever that took Catherine, through Silas's violent departure and Mary's long years of solitude. But tonight, those words felt different, less like comfort and more like a challenge to trust in something beyond her own understanding. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up, though she could distinguish between visitors by sound alone. These were the measured steps of men who came bearing authority. Sheriff Coleman again, accompanied by at least 2 others, whose gait suggested they carried the weight of community responsibility. "Miss McGraw," Sheriff Coleman called out, his voice carrying forced politeness. "Might we have a word?" Mary closed the Bible carefully, setting it aside as she prepared for what she suspected would be another attempt to manage her future without her consent. "Of course, Sheriff, though I should mention that my brother is somewhere about the property. Actually, it's you we came to speak with."
"Privately, if possible."
The request surprised her. In 5 years of living alone, no one had ever sought her opinion on matters of importance. She was someone things happened to, not someone whose thoughts carried weight in community decisions. "I'm listening," she said simply. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat, and Mary could hear the rustle of paper as someone, probably Judge Morrison, based on the scent of expensive tobacco, consulted what sounded like official documents. "Miss McGraw, we've come to discuss your situation, your future welfare specifically, and certain concerning reports about your brother's intentions." Mary felt her spine straighten. Drawing on the dignity her mother had taught her was every person's birthright, regardless of circumstances. "What sort of intentions?" "There's been talk," Judge Morrison said carefully, "about plans to remove you from the community, to take you somewhere without proper oversight or civilized society to protect your interests." "I see." Mary kept her voice level despite the anger building in her chest. "And who exactly has been discussing these plans?" "Because I certainly haven't been consulted about my own future." "Now, Miss McGraw," Sheriff Coleman said, in the tone men used when they wanted to sound reasonable while dismissing a woman's concerns, "we understand this is difficult, but your brother's reputation precedes him. His violent tendencies are well documented, are they?" Mary asked quietly. "Could you be specific about these documented violent tendencies? Because from where I sit, Silas has never harmed anyone who wasn't actively hurting his family." The men exchanged glances she couldn't see, but could sense in the sudden shift of their postures. They'd expected compliance, perhaps even gratitude for their concern. Her quiet challenge seemed to catch them off guard. "The incident 5 years ago," Judge Morrison began, "was my brother defending me from 3 drunk men who were physically assaulting me for their entertainment." Mary interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "Would you have preferred he allowed them to continue?" "Of course not, but then perhaps you could explain exactly what violent tendencies you're concerned about. Has Silas threatened anyone since his return? Has he raised his hand to any person who wasn't actively harming his family? Or are you simply uncomfortable with the idea that someone might refuse to accept your judgments about my life?" The silence that followed was thick with uncomfortable truth. Mary could hear shifting feet, nervous coughs, the whisper of clothing as the men adjusted their positions, like soldiers, realizing they'd walked into an ambush. It was Judge Morrison who finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the careful authority of a man used to having his decisions accepted without question. "Miss McGraw, we're concerned about reports that your brother intends to take you away from Cedar Ridge, away from the community that has cared for you during his absence." "Cared for me," Mary repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what you call it? Because I remember 5 years of charity that came with conditions, help that had to be earned through grateful submission, and constant reminders that I should be thankful for scraps of basic human kindness. You've been provided for." "I've been managed," Mary corrected firmly. "My future has been debated like a community project, my personal life discussed like entertainment, and my worth measured entirely by how little trouble I cause for people who see me as their burden to bear." The words came out with surprising force, carrying 5 years of accumulated frustration and carefully suppressed anger. Mary felt a strange sense of liberation in finally speaking truths she'd kept buried under layers of polite gratitude and dignified endurance. "Miss McGraw," Sheriff Coleman said carefully, "we understand you may feel—" "Do you?" Mary stood, drawing herself up to her full height with the quiet dignity her mother had modeled through every hardship. "Do you understand what it's like to listen to people plan your future like you're not in the room? Do you understand what it's like to be grateful for charity that comes with lectures about knowing your place? Do you understand what it's like to watch every girl your age find love and marriage while you're told to be thankful for the opportunity to work for your keep?" Each question hit like a physical blow, stripping away the comfortable assumptions that allowed good people to participate in casual cruelty. Mary could feel the men shifting uncomfortably, forced to confront realities they'd preferred to ignore. "We only want what's best for you," Judge Morrison said finally. "No," Mary replied quietly. "You want what's most convenient for you. You want me grateful and manageable and willing to accept whatever arrangement requires the least effort on your part. But I'm 18 years old, gentlemen. I'm not a child to be managed or a problem to be solved. I'm a woman capable of making my own decisions about my own life." The declaration hung in the evening air like a challenge to everything the community had assumed about Mary McGraw. She could hear Silas's footsteps approaching from behind the cabin, drawn by the sound of raised voices, but for once she didn't need his protection. The strength she'd cultivated during his absence was finally finding its voice. "Your brother's influence," Sheriff Coleman began. "My brother's influence has nothing to do with this," Mary interrupted. "These are my thoughts, my feelings, my decisions. Silas didn't teach me to value my own dignity. Our mother did. He didn't show me I deserved better than charity disguised as kindness. 5 years of your charity did that." Silas appeared around the corner of the cabin, moving with the fluid grace that marked him as a man comfortable with violence but in perfect control of it. He took in the scene at a glance, his sister standing alone against 3 men who represented the full authority of their small community, and Mary could feel his pride radiating. "Like warmth from a fire, gentlemen," he said quietly. "I trust you're not bothering my sister with more helpful suggestions about her future?" "We came to speak with Miss McGraw about your plans," Judge Morrison said stiffly. "About reports that you intend to remove her from proper society." "And what did she tell you?" All eyes turned to Mary, waiting for her response. To a question that would define not just her immediate future but the entire relationship between the McGraw family and the community that had tried to manage them both. Mary felt the weight of the moment settling over her like a mantle of responsibility. For 18 years, she'd accepted other people's definitions of what was possible for her life. She'd been grateful for scraps, thankful for charity, and careful never to ask for more than what others were willing to give. But standing there in the gathering dusk, with her brother's strength at her back and her mother's Bible clutched in her hand, Mary McGraw made a choice that would change everything. "I told them," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the valley like a bell, "that I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my own life. And if my brother has plans that include me, then those are our family's private concerns, not community property to be debated and managed. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of a decision that challenged every assumption the town had made about the McGraw siblings. Mary could feel the shift in the evening air, the recognition that something fundamental had changed in the balance of power between the family and the community that had tried to control them. Judge Morrison cleared his throat with obvious discomfort. "Miss McGraw, I hope you'll reconsider. There are proper channels for what?" Mary asked quietly. "For a disabled woman to find her place in the world? For someone like me to build a life worth living? Forgive me, Judge Morrison, but your proper channels have offered me exactly 3 options in 18 years. Grateful servitude, charitable spinsterhood, or marriage to men who saw me as entertainment. Now see here." "No," Silas said quietly, stepping closer to his sister in a gesture of unmistakable solidarity. "You see here, you've had 5 years to prove you could care for Mary properly. 5 years to show her the respect and dignity every person deserves. Instead, you've treated her like a problem to be managed and a burden to be endured. We've done our best under difficult circumstances." Sheriff Coleman protested. "Your best," Silas replied with quiet intensity, "wasn't good enough. Your best left my sister grateful for charity and apologetic for existing. Your best made her feel like she should be thankful for scraps of basic human kindness." Mary felt tears threaten for the first time in years, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being seen as worthy of protection and respect. Her brother understood. After 5 years of absence, Silas understood exactly what her life had been like and exactly why it needed to change. "We won't be needing your help anymore," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was declaring. "Whatever plans my brother and I make for our future, there'll be our decisions to make and our consequences to bear." The men left with promises of future intervention and warnings about the dangers of isolation, but Mary barely heard them. She was too busy feeling the strange sensation of her world, reshaping itself around new possibilities. Possibilities that didn't require her to be grateful for less than she deserved or apologetic for wanting more than others were willing to give. When the last echo of their footsteps faded, Silas came to sit beside her on the porch steps. The evening air was cool and sweet, with the scent of wildflowers, and somewhere in the distance a night bird called to its mate with liquid notes that spoke of connection and belonging. "That was well done," Silas said quietly. "I surprised myself," Mary admitted. "I've spent so many years being grateful and careful and strong," Silas interrupted gently. "Don't forget strong, Mary. You've been strong through things that would have broken most people." Mary absorbed this, recognizing truth in words she'd never dared to apply to herself. She had been strong. She'd survived the loss of their parents, Silas's absence, the cruelties of well-meaning neighbors, and the slow erosion of hope that came with repeated rejection. She'd built a life from nothing and maintained her dignity through circumstances that would have crushed someone with less determination. "But strength isn't enough anymore," she said quietly. "I want more than just survival, Silas. I want a life that doesn't require me to be grateful for basic human decency. I want to matter to someone the way other women matter to the men who love them." "You matter to me," Silas said simply. "I know. But I want—" She struggled for words to express longings she'd barely admitted to herself. "I want to be chosen rather than tolerated. I want to be valued rather than managed. I want to be someone's first priority instead of everyone's charitable obligation." Silas was quiet for a long moment, and Mary could feel him weighing words with the careful precision of a man who understood that what he said next might change both their lives forever. "What if I told you," he said finally, "that there was a way to guarantee you'd never be anyone's charitable obligation again? A way to make sure you were always someone's first priority?" Mary's breath caught in her throat, recognizing the dangerous territory they were approaching. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe it's time we stopped letting other people define what's possible for our family. Maybe it's time we made our own rules." The words hung between them like a bridge over an impossible chasm, offering salvation at a price that would shock the world they'd known. Mary felt her heart begin to race as she grasped the implications of what he was suggesting. "Silas, think about it, Mary. Really think about it. What if there was a way to give you all the legal protections of marriage, all the social status of being a wife, all the security of knowing you'd never face the world alone again?" You're talking about something impossible. Am I? Or am I talking about something unconventional? There's a difference. Mary sat in stunned silence, her mind reeling with the audacity of what he was proposing. Marriage to her own brother, the one person who had never seen her as damaged or incomplete, who had protected her without expecting gratitude, who was offering her a partnership rather than charity. "People would never accept it," she whispered. "People don't accept you now," he pointed out gently. "At least this way, they'd have to respect your position while they whispered about it." The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of church bells ringing across the valley, calling the faithful to evening prayers. Mary listened to the familiar sound with new awareness, recognizing that whatever path they chose would take them far from the conventional faith and social structures that had governed their lives. "Until now, I need time to think," she said. "Finally, take all the time you need," Silas replied. "But remember, Mary, sometimes the most impossible solutions are the only ones that work." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Mary McGraw sat holding her mother's Bible and contemplating the most shocking proposal of her life, wondering if salvation sometimes came disguised as scandal, and if love could take forms too radical for the world to understand. The town charter lay spread across their kitchen table like a map to forbidden territory, its formal language offering both obstacles and opportunities that neither Mary nor Silas had fully anticipated. The thick parchment, sealed with territorial authority and signed by founding fathers who'd never imagined the McGraw family's particular dilemma, contained provisions that could either damn their plans or provide unexpected salvation. "According to this," Silas said, running his finger along the relevant passage, while Mary listened with focused intensity, "marriage licenses require posting of banns for 2 weeks prior to ceremony, along with verification of eligible status and absence of impediments." Mary traced the edge of the charter with nervous fingers, feeling the raised seal that marked it as official territorial law. Impediments meaning? Prior marriage, insufficient age, consanguinity within forbidden degrees. His voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the tension underneath. Siblings definitely qualify as consanguineous within forbidden degrees, so we can't marry here legally, not under Cedar Ridge's jurisdiction. But these territorial laws don't apply everywhere. Circuit preachers operate under different authority, and some territories have more flexible interpretations of marriage requirements. Mary absorbed this information, recognizing both opportunity and danger in what he was suggesting. "You're talking about finding someone willing to perform a ceremony that might not be recognized elsewhere." "I'm talking about finding someone operating under different legal authority," Silas corrected carefully. "There are places where the law is more concerned with territorial expansion than social convention. Places where a marriage performed by proper religious authority is valid, regardless of local prejudices." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Measured, confident, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Mary recognized the gait immediately, Judge Morrison, but this time alone, walking with the purposeful stride of a man who came bearing serious business rather than community sentiment. "Judge Morrison," Silas said, opening the door before the man could knock. "What brings you by?" "Need to speak with you both, privately." Morrison's voice carried a weight that suggested this visit was different from the morning's official delegation. "May I come in?" Mary felt her heart begin to race, wondering if their planning had somehow been discovered, if the town's suspicions had crystallized into legal action. But when Morrison entered their cabin, his manner suggested negotiation rather than confrontation. "I've come with a proposition," he said, settling into the chair Silas offered with careful deliberation. One that might solve everyone's problems. What sort of proposition? Mary asked, her voice steady despite the apprehension building in her chest. Morrison consulted a document that rustled importantly in the cabin's stillness. I've been reviewing territorial law regarding guardianship and protective arrangements. As it happens, there are provisions for establishing legal guardianship over citizens who require special oversight. The words hit Mary like a physical blow, their implications clear despite Morrison's careful phrasing. You're talking about having me declared incompetent. I'm talking about establishing a legal framework that would protect your interests while ensuring proper supervision. Morrison corrected with the sort of paternal tone that made Mary's hands clench into fists. With your brother's unstable history and your own physical limitations, the court could easily conclude that independent living poses unnecessary risks. Silas rose from his chair with fluid grace, moving to stand behind Mary's seat in a gesture of unmistakable protection. And who would serve as this guardian? The court would appoint someone suitable, someone with the community's trust and the authority to make decisions in Miss McGraw's best interests. Morrison's smile carried smug satisfaction. Someone like myself, perhaps, or another respected member of the community. The threat was explicit despite its legal camouflage. Submit to arranged marriage with one of their chosen candidates, or face court-ordered guardianship that would strip Mary of any legal right to control her own life. She would become property of the state, managed by men who saw her as fundamentally incompetent to make her own decisions. That's assuming the court would agree with your assessment, Mary said quietly, drawing on reserves of strength she'd cultivated during Silas's absence. Which seems to assume I'm incapable of caring for myself, despite 5 years of evidence to the contrary. 5 years of dependency on community charity, Morrison corrected smoothly. 5 years of struggling to maintain basic living standards. 5 years of isolation that hardly demonstrates competent independent living. 5 years of survival without help from anyone who didn't demand gratitude and submission in return, Mary replied, her voice growing stronger. 5 years of maintaining this property, managing finances, and proving I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions. Morrison's expression shifted, recognizing that he wasn't dealing with the grateful, manageable invalid he'd expected. Miss McGraw, I'm trying to offer you a reasonable alternative to whatever foolish plan your brother has convinced you to consider. Legal guardianship would provide security and protection. Legal guardianship would provide control and ownership, Silas interrupted, his voice carrying the same dangerous calm Mary remembered from confrontations past. You'd own her decisions, her property, her entire life. She'd become your legal property to manage as you see fit. I'd become responsible for her welfare, Morrison corrected stiffly, which is more than can be said for a brother who abandoned her for 5 years and now returns with disruptive plans that serve no one's interest but his own. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, demanding response to charges that struck uncomfortably close to truth. Silas had abandoned Mary. His protective plans were disruptive, and his motives were admittedly selfish. But Morrison's alternative offered no dignity, no independence, and no hope of anything approaching equality. Judge Morrison, Mary said quietly, may I ask you something directly? Of course. In your vision of proper guardianship, what would my daily life look like? What decisions would I be allowed to make for myself? What freedoms would I retain? Morrison shifted uncomfortably, apparently not having expected to defend the practical implications of his legal maneuvering. You would be cared for appropriately. Your needs would be met, your welfare protected. That's not what I asked, Mary interrupted gently. I asked what my life would look like. Would I choose my own clothing? Decide what to eat for breakfast? Determine how to spend my time? Choose my own friends and social activities? Each question forced Morrison to confront the reality that legal guardianship would reduce Mary to the status of a child, Stripped of every right that marked her as an adult, capable of independent thought and action, your guardian would naturally consider your preferences. But the final decisions would be his, Mary said quietly. My preferences would be considered only if they aligned with his judgment about what was appropriate for someone in my situation. Miss McGraw, you're being unrealistic about... I'm being realistic about the difference between protection and ownership, Mary replied with quiet intensity. You're offering to make me legal property of someone who sees me as fundamentally incapable of managing my own existence. How is that different from slavery? The comparison shocked Morrison into uncomfortable silence, forcing him to confront implications he'd apparently preferred to avoid. Legal guardianship over a competent adult was indeed a form of ownership, stripping away every right that distinguished free citizens from property. Your situation requires special considerations, he said finally. My situation requires respect for my dignity and autonomy, Mary corrected firmly, neither of which is possible. Under legal arrangements that treat me as incompetent property, to be managed by men who've never bothered to ask what I actually want from life. Silas placed a protective hand on Mary's shoulder, his touch offering strength and solidarity. I think you have your answer, Judge Morrison. My sister prefers to remain free rather than become anyone's legal property. Morrison rose with obvious displeasure, recognizing that his carefully planned negotiation had collapsed under Mary's refusal to accept diminished status in exchange for security. You're making a mistake, Miss McGraw. Both of you are making mistakes that will have serious consequences. Perhaps, Mary agreed quietly. But they'll be our mistakes to make and our consequences to bear, which is more than your guardianship would offer. After Morrison left with promises of legal action and warnings about defying court authority, Mary and Silas sat in their kitchen, surrounded by the scattered papers that represented their father's hidden legacy and their own dangerous plans. He means it, Silas said quietly. About the guardianship proceedings, Morrison has enough influence to make it happen if we give him time. Then we don't give him time, Mary replied, surprising herself with the decisiveness in her voice. We move forward with our own plans before he can move forward with his. Are you certain? Once we take this step, there's no going back. No returning to the way things were, no making peace with the community we're leaving behind. Mary considered this, weighing the finality of what they were contemplating against the alternatives Morrison had made clear. Legal guardianship that would strip her of every dignity. Arranged marriage to men who saw her as convenient property. A life of grateful submission to people who measured her worth entirely by how little trouble she caused. Or marriage to the one person who had never seen her as anything less than whole, I'm certain, she said quietly. Whatever this costs us, whatever people say about it, it has to be better than becoming someone's legal property. Silas was quiet for a long moment, and Mary could feel him wrestling with the magnitude of what they were deciding. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of final commitment. Then we need to move quickly. Find a preacher willing to perform the ceremony, arrange transportation to Montana Territory, and disappear before Morrison can file his guardianship petition. How long do we have? Legal proceedings take time, but not much time when the judge is motivated and the case seems straightforward. A week, maybe 2 at most. Mary absorbed this, recognizing that their entire future would be determined in the next few days. Everything they'd known, everyone they'd been, would be left behind in favor of an uncertain future built on an impossible foundation. There's something else we need to discuss, Silas said carefully. Something about what this marriage would actually mean in practical terms. Mary felt her heart begin to race, recognizing that they were approaching the most difficult conversation of their lives. They discussed the legal benefits and social implications of their plan, but they'd carefully avoided talking about the intimate realities of marriage between siblings. What do you mean? I mean that people will expect certain things from a married couple. They'll watch for signs of normal married life. They'll notice if we don't share living quarters, if we don't behave like husband and wife. Mary absorbed this, understanding the implications without needing explicit details. Marriage meant shared bedrooms, physical intimacy, the appearance of romantic love rather than practical arrangement. Their charade would need to be complete and convincing if it was to protect them both, and you're willing to maintain that appearance. If you are, Silas said quietly. Mary, I need you to understand that this isn't about desire or romance or anything that would make either of us uncomfortable. It's about creating a believable life together, one that protects us both from questions we can't answer. Mary considered this, recognizing both the necessity and the complexity of what he was suggesting. They would need to be husband and wife in every observable way, creating a partnership that appeared conventional while being built on foundations no one could imagine. "What would you expect from me?" she asked quietly. "Nothing you're not willing to give," Silas replied immediately. "We'll work out the details as we go, Mary. Figure out what's comfortable for both of us and what's necessary for appearances. But I need you to know that nothing will happen that you don't agree to. Nothing that makes you feel compromised or uncomfortable." The assurance settled some of Mary's fears while raising new questions about the practical realities of their impossible marriage. How did siblings become convincing spouses? How did protective love transform into something that could pass for romantic partnership? "I trust you," she said finally, recognizing the simple truth of those words. Whatever else was uncertain about their future, Silas had never given her reason to doubt his commitment to her welfare above all other considerations. "Then we're agreed. We move forward with this plan, accept whatever consequences follow, and trust each other to make it work." Mary felt the weight of the moment settling over her like a mantle of responsibility. For 18 years, she'd accepted other people's definitions of what was possible for her life. She'd been grateful for scraps, thankful for charity, and careful never to ask for more than what others were willing to give. But sitting there in the gathering dusk, with her brother's strength at her back and her father's hidden legacy spread before them, Mary McGraw made a choice that would change everything. "We're agreed," she said quietly. "Let's plan a wedding." The next morning brought practical considerations that transformed their impossible romance into urgent logistics. Mary woke to the sound of Silas packing supplies, the careful organization of a man preparing for a journey that would carry them far from everything they'd ever known. Circuit preacher named Father McKenna operates out of a mining camp about 2 days' ride north, Silas said, consulting a hand-drawn map he'd acquired from sources Mary didn't ask about. He's got a reputation for being flexible about marriage requirements, especially for people with money to express their gratitude, meaning he'll perform the ceremony without asking inconvenient questions, meaning he'll perform the ceremony under territorial authority that doesn't recognize local marriage restrictions. What we tell him about our relationship is our business. Mary considered this, recognizing both opportunity and risk in relying on a stranger's discretion. And afterward, we travel to Montana Territory, establish residence on Father's land, and begin building the life we should have had all along. The plan sounded simple when stated plainly, but Mary understood the complexities hidden beneath Silas's confident summary. They would need to travel together as husband and wife, establish themselves in a new community as a married couple, and maintain their deception for the rest of their lives. Are you certain we can convince people that we can act married well enough to avoid suspicion? Silas was quiet for a moment, considering challenges they'd both recognized, but neither had fully articulated. "We'll have to learn, Mary. Figure out what married couples do and how they behave with each other. Practice until it becomes natural." "Practice," Mary repeated, recognizing the strangeness of learning to be married to her own brother. "What exactly would we practice?" "Simple things, mostly. How we speak to each other, how we stand together. The casual touches that married people share without thinking about it." His voice carried careful neutrality, but Mary could sense the deeper complexities he was avoiding. "We'll start small and work our way up to whatever feels natural for both of us." Mary absorbed this, understanding that their success would depend on transforming a lifetime of sibling affection into something that could pass for romantic love. It seemed impossible, but then again, everything about their situation was impossible. "Show me," she said quietly. "Show you what?" "Show me how a husband would speak to his wife, how he would touch her, stand with her, act when others are watching." Mary felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment, but pressed forward despite her discomfort. "If we're going to convince people, I need to know what they'll expect to see." Silas moved closer, close enough that Mary could feel the warmth of his presence and smell the familiar scent of leather and pine that had always clung to him. When he spoke, his voice carried a gentleness she'd never heard before, softer, more intimate, touched with the sort of affection that implied romantic love rather than brotherly protection. "Good morning, my dear," he said quietly, his hand settling on her shoulder with careful tenderness. "Did you sleep well?" The simple words carried emotional weight that made Mary's breath catch in her throat. This wasn't the voice of her protective older brother. This was the voice of a man speaking to a woman he cherished, cared for, wanted to make happy. "That's different," she managed. "It has to be different," Silas agreed, his hand moving to cup her cheek with the sort of casual intimacy that spoke of established love. "Mary, we're going to be husband and wife. People will expect to see affection, tenderness, the kind of touches that happen naturally between people who love each other." Mary leaned into his touch despite herself, recognizing how starved she'd been for gentle physical contact. 5 years of living alone had taught her to be grateful for any kindness, but she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be touched with love rather than pity. "Like this?" she asked, placing her own hand over his and turning her face into his. "Palm, exactly like that," his voice carried approval and something else, a warmth that made Mary wonder if perhaps this wouldn't be as impossible as she'd feared. "You're a natural at this, Mary, am I?" "You are. You just need to trust your instincts and remember that we care about each other. The rest will follow naturally." Mary felt some of her tension ease, recognizing truth in his words. They did care about each other deeply and completely, perhaps transforming that care into something that could pass for romantic love wouldn't require as much pretending as she'd imagined. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders, multiple horses, moving at speed toward their property. Mary recognized the urgency in their pace, the kind of speed that meant serious trouble. "Company," Silas observed, his voice shifting back to the careful neutrality that marked his preparation for conflict. "And they're in a hurry. How many?" "Too many. Mary, I think our time just ran out." The riders proved to be a full posse: Sheriff Coleman, Judge Morrison, Minister Patterson, and 6 armed men whose presence suggested they'd come prepared for resistance. They dismounted with military precision, their faces grim with the sort of determination that brooked no argument or negotiation. Mary felt Silas tense beside her, his hand moving instinctively toward the hunting knife at his belt, before stopping as he calculated the odds. 8 armed men against 1, with Mary's safety to consider. Even Silas's mountain-honed skills couldn't overcome those numbers without putting his sister at risk. "McGraw," Sheriff Coleman called out, his voice carrying official authority backed by overwhelming force. "We're here to place your sister under protective custody pending court review of her competency." "On whose authority?" Silas demanded, though Mary could hear the futility in his voice. Judge Morrison consulted a document that rustled with official importance. "By order of the Territorial Court, acting on petition submitted this morning regarding the welfare of one Mary Catherine McGraw, age 18, alleged to be living without proper supervision and vulnerable to manipulation by parties with questionable motives." The legal language hit Mary like a physical blow, reducing her to the status of property to be managed by men who'd never bothered to ask what she wanted from life. In a single morning, Judge Morrison had transformed her from a free citizen into a ward of the state, subject to whatever arrangements the court deemed appropriate. "This is illegal," Mary said quietly. Drawing on reserves of dignity, her mother had taught her belonged to every person, regardless of circumstances. "I'm 18 years old and perfectly capable of making my own decisions. I've been managing my own affairs for 5 years without incident. 5 years of struggling to maintain basic living standards," Minister Patterson corrected with paternal condescension. 5 years of isolation and dependency that hardly demonstrate competent, independent living. 5 years of survival without help from anyone who didn't demand submission in return, Mary replied, her voice growing stronger despite the fear building in her chest. 5 years of proving I'm capable of independence when given the chance. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward with the weary expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else but felt bound by duty. "Miss McGraw, this doesn't have to be difficult. Come with us voluntarily, and we'll ensure you're treated with all proper respect during the court proceedings. And if I refuse, then we'll exercise our legal authority to take you into protective custody for your own welfare," Judge Morrison answered with smug satisfaction. "The court has determined that your current living situation poses unnecessary risks to your safety and well-being." Mary felt the trap closing around her with the inexorable force of legal machinery designed to strip away any rights that might interfere with community judgment. She would be taken, evaluated by men who'd already decided she was incompetent, and assigned to whatever guardian Morrison deemed appropriate. "How long?" she asked quietly. "How long what? How long do I have to gather my belongings before you take me?" The question seemed to catch them off guard, as if they'd expected more resistance to what amounted to legal kidnapping. Sheriff Coleman consulted with Judge Morrison in whispered conversation before responding. 15 minutes to pack essential items. "Nothing more," Mary nodded with apparent calm, though her mind was racing through desperate possibilities. 15 minutes to say goodbye to everything she'd ever known. To accept that her life as Mary McGraw was ending, and whatever came next would be determined by men who saw her as property to be managed. "Silas," she said quietly, "would you help me gather my things?" He moved to escort her inside, but Judge Morrison's voice stopped them at the door. "Mr. McGraw will remain outside during packing. We can't allow unsupervised consultation that might influence Miss McGraw's cooperation with these proceedings." The restriction was the final insult, stripping away even the comfort of her brother's presence during what might be their last moments together. Mary would pack alone, under the watchful eyes of strangers who saw her as fundamentally incapable of independent thought. "I understand," she said quietly, though her voice carried undertones that suggested she understood far more than they realized. Inside the cabin, Mary moved with careful efficiency while 2 armed men watched her every gesture. She packed practical clothing, personal items, and the few treasures that connected her to happier times. But she also packed things the watchers couldn't see, small items that might prove useful in ways they couldn't imagine. Her mother's wedding ring, thin gold band that Catherine McGraw had worn through 23 years of marriage and frontier hardship. The ring was too large for Mary's finger, but it carried symbolic weight that might prove important in circumstances she could barely imagine. The wooden box Silas had given her, with its cargo of memory and meaning that connected her to the brother they were trying to separate her from. The box was small enough to hide among her clothing, personal enough that even suspicious guards wouldn't think to examine its contents. Most importantly, the documents from their father's strongbox, birth certificates, land grants, bank statements, and legal papers that proved Mary Catherine McGraw was not the penniless invalid Judge Morrison had described to the court. Hidden among her undergarments, where no respectable man would search. These papers represented freedom if she could find a way to use them. "Time's up," one of the guards announced. Though Mary suspected she'd been given less than the promised 15 minutes. She emerged from the cabin, carrying a single carpet bag and wearing the traveling dress that had belonged to her mother. Simple, practical clothing that wouldn't attract attention, but carried enough quality to suggest she came from respectable circumstances. Silas stood surrounded by armed men like a prisoner awaiting execution. his face carefully neutral, but his eyes burning with helpless rage. Mary met his gaze across the space that separated them, trying to convey everything she couldn't say aloud. "Trust me," her expression said. "This isn't over. I know," his eyes replied. "I'll find you." "Miss McGraw," Sheriff Coleman said with uncomfortable gentleness, "if you'll come with us, we'll escort you to temporary housing while the court makes arrangements for your long-term care." Mary nodded with apparent resignation, playing the role of the compliant invalid they expected her to be. "May I say goodbye to my brother?" Brief goodbyes only, no private conversation. She approached Silas with careful steps, aware that every gesture was being watched and evaluated by men looking for signs of conspiracy or resistance. When she reached him, she rose on her toes, as if to kiss his cheek in sisterly farewell. But instead of words of goodbye, she whispered something that made his eyes widen with sudden understanding. "Check Mother's sewing box tonight. Under the false bottom." The message was delivered and received in seconds, hidden beneath the sort of emotional farewell that seemed natural between siblings being forcibly separated. Mary stepped back with tears in her eyes, real tears, because she genuinely didn't know when or if she'd see her brother again. "Take care of yourself," she said aloud, her voice carrying the sort of brave sadness that made even the armed guards shift uncomfortably. "I will," Silas replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "And Mary, remember that you're stronger than anyone gives you credit for, including yourself." The parting words carried more meaning than their watchers could possibly understand. Silas was reminding her that she'd survived 5 years alone, that she'd built strength through adversity, that she was capable of more than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. The ride to town was conducted in careful silence, with Mary mounted on a gentle mare and surrounded by guards, who treated her like fragile cargo that might break if handled roughly. She used the time to observe, to listen, to gather information that might prove useful in whatever came next. Judge Morrison rode ahead, consulting documents and making notes that suggested he was already planning her future without her input. Sheriff Coleman stayed close to Mary's horse, his expression suggesting he felt uncomfortable with his role in what amounted to legal kidnapping. The other men treated the entire proceeding as routine law enforcement, apparently seeing nothing wrong with stripping a competent adult of her freedom for the crime of refusing arranged marriage. Their destination proved to be a small house behind. The church, normally used for visiting clergy, but now serving as Mary's prison while the court decided her fate. The building was comfortable enough. Clean rooms, adequate furnishing, even a small garden where she might take supervised exercise. But it was still a prison, with locks on the doors and bars on the windows, and guards who would ensure she remained available for whatever arrangements Judge Morrison deemed appropriate. "You'll be comfortable here," Minister Patterson assured her as he showed her to the main room. "Mrs. Patterson will check on you regularly, ensure your needs are met, help you prepare for the court proceedings." "How long will I be here?" "Until the court makes final determination about your guardianship arrangement." "A few days, perhaps a week at most." Mary nodded with apparent acceptance, though her mind was already working through possibilities and escape routes. A week to find a way out before becoming someone's legal property. A week to turn Judge Morrison's legal maneuvering against him. A week to prove that Mary McGraw was far more capable than anyone had imagined. "May I ask about the proceedings themselves?" she said with careful humility. "What will be expected of me?" "You'll be evaluated by a court-appointed physician to assess your mental and physical capacity for independent living. You'll be interviewed by representatives of potential guardians to determine the most suitable arrangement, and you'll have opportunity to express any preferences about your future care." "Preferences," Mary repeated thoughtfully. "Would my preferences carry any weight in the final decision?" Minister Patterson shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the trap in her question. "The court will naturally consider your wishes, but the final decision will be based on professional assessment of your best interests." I see. And who determines what constitutes my best interests? The same men who arranged this proceeding without, consulting me, the same community that spent years treating me like charity goods. Miss McGraw, I understand you may feel, I feel like I'm being sold to the highest bidder, Mary interrupted quietly, dressed up in legal language about protection and welfare, but ultimately reduced to property, to be managed by men who see me as fundamentally incapable of independent thought. The stark truth of her words seemed to shock Minister Patterson into uncomfortable silence. He'd apparently expected gratitude for the community's efforts to provide for her welfare, not clear-eyed recognition of what those efforts actually entailed. Your situation requires special considerations, he said finally. My situation requires respect for my dignity and autonomy, Mary replied with quiet intensity. Neither of which is possible under arrangements that treat competent adults like children to be managed by their betters. After Minister Patterson left with promises of regular supervision and warnings about the consequences of uncooperative behavior, Mary found herself alone in her comfortable prison with time to think and plan. The first thing she did was explore her surroundings with the thorough attention of someone who might need to escape quickly. The windows were barred, but the bars were old, set in wooden frames that might yield to pressure applied in the right places. The doors were locked, but the locks were simple, designed to keep out casual intruders rather than determined prisoners. The second thing she did was examine the contents of her carefully packed carpet bag, taking inventory of resources that might prove useful in circumstances her captors couldn't imagine. Her mother's wedding ring, symbol of a partnership that had lasted until death separated the participants. The wooden box with its cargo of memory and meaning that connected her to the one person who would never stop looking for her. And most importantly, the documents that proved Mary Catherine McGraw was not the penniless invalid Judge Morrison had described to the court, but a woman with property rights, bank accounts, and legal standing that might surprise everyone involved in her forced guardianship. The third thing she did was sit by the window and think about what Silas would find when he checked their mother's sewing box, hidden beneath the false bottom that had escaped notice during years of casual searching. Catherine McGraw had been a woman of careful foresight, one who understood that frontier life required preparation for circumstances that might seem impossible until they suddenly became inevitable. She'd hidden things in that sewing box, important things that she'd hoped her children would never need, but had prepared, just in case the world proved crueler than even she had imagined. Marriage documents from another territory, carefully preserved, and legally valid, that could be completed by any ordained minister with authority to perform weddings. Bank drafts that could be converted to cash without requiring explanations about family relationships or the source of funds. Even a letter, written in Catherine's careful script, explaining provisions she'd made for circumstances too shocking to discuss openly, but too important to leave to chance. Mary had discovered these treasures during her mother's final illness, when Catherine had grown desperate enough to share secrets she'd hoped to carry to her grave. Sometimes, her mother had whispered through fever-cracked lips, love requires choices that shock the world but save the people who matter most. At the time, Mary hadn't understood what her mother meant, but sitting in her comfortable prison, waiting for men to decide her fate like livestock at auction, Catherine McGraw's final gift suddenly made perfect sense. Outside her barred window, the sun was setting over Cedar Ridge with golden light that painted familiar mountains in shades of amber and rose. Mary watched the daily miracle of sunset while her mind worked through possibilities that would either free them both or damn them beyond redemption. Tomorrow, Judge Morrison would begin the legal proceedings that would strip her of every right that marked her as a free citizen. But tonight, Silas would discover their mother's final gift, and the balance of power would shift in ways that no one in Cedar Ridge could possibly anticipate. Mary Catherine McGraw settled into her chair by the window and began to wait, secure. in the knowledge that her brother would find a way to reach her, and that when he did, they would have everything they needed to claim the impossible life their mother had prepared for them. The wedding ring felt warm in her hand as she turned it between her fingers, thinking about partnerships that lasted until death and love that took forms too radical for the world to understand. Tomorrow would bring legal proceedings designed to strip her of independence and dignity. But tomorrow would also bring Silas, armed with their mother's blessings and the tools they needed to claim a future that belonged to them alone. That night, as Cedar Ridge settled into the peaceful rhythms of frontier sleep, Silas McGraw discovered that his mother had been far more than the simple frontier woman she'd appeared to be. The hidden compartment in Catherine's sewing box revealed not just the marriage documents and bank drafts Mary had mentioned, but a carefully preserved deed that would change everything he thought he knew about their family's circumstances. The deed was written on expensive parchment, sealed with territorial authority, and signed by officials whose names carried weight far beyond their small mountain community. But it wasn't the official nature of the document that made Silas's hands tremble as he read it by lamplight. It was the scope of what his parents had secretly accumulated during years of appearing. To live as simple homesteaders, 5,000 acres in Montana territory, water rights to 3 separate river systems, mineral rights to what the document described as proven silver deposits of significant commercial value, and most shocking of all, a mining operation that had been generating substantial income for over 15 years, managed by partners who'd been sending payments to a bank account Thomas and Catherine McGraw had never mentioned to their children. Silas set the deed aside with careful reverence and reached for the accompanying letter, written in his mother's precise script, but dated only weeks before her death. The paper rustled in the lamplight as he unfolded words that would explain years of carefully maintained deception. My dearest children, if you are reading this, then circumstances have forced you to consider choices that no family should ever face. Your father and I hoped these documents would never be needed, but we prepared them because we understood that love sometimes requires decisions that shock the world but save the people who matter most. The land in Montana is yours by right of inheritance, but more than that, it is your refuge. We chose that territory specifically because it operates under laws that value property rights over social convention, where established landowners are granted respect regardless of how they came to their circumstances. The mining operation has been managed by our partner, Samuel Crawford, who believes Thomas and I died childless. He will continue operating under that assumption unless you choose to claim your inheritance, at which point he will be required to surrender full ownership and accumulated profits to Thomas McGraw's heirs. But Mary, my sweet girl, there is something else you must know. The inheritance laws in Montana territory contain provisions that your father and I studied carefully during the difficult years when we feared you might never find conventional happiness. A married woman can claim inheritance independently of any guardian or family authority. More importantly, a woman married under valid religious authority, regardless of local social objections, has full legal standing to control property, make contracts, and live free from anyone's supervision or interference. We researched these laws because we understood that you might someday need protection that conventional society would never provide. If circumstances ever force you to choose between your dignity and their approval, choose dignity. Choose freedom. Choose each other. The marriage documents in this box are legally valid in 7 territories, including Montana. They require only completion and filing with proper religious authority to grant you all the protections of law, regardless of what Cedar Ridge thinks of your choices. Your father and I loved each other completely, but we also understood that love takes many forms. The bond between you children has always been stronger than blood, deeper than conventional relationships, more loyal than most marriages we've observed. If that bond needs legal protection to survive in a cruel world, Then claim it without shame. We are proud of the people you have become. We trust your judgment about what your lives require. And we bless whatever choices you make in pursuit of happiness and freedom. All our love, Mother. Silas read the letter twice before the full implications settled in his mind, like pieces of a puzzle that had been missing crucial elements. His parents hadn't just anticipated their children's difficulties. They'd spent years preparing solutions that seemed impossible until suddenly they became inevitable. The inheritance wasn't just land and money. It was independence, status, and the legal foundation for a life that could be built on their own terms rather than society's expectations. Mary wouldn't just be escaping Judge Morrison's guardianship. She'd be claiming wealth and position that would make her untouchable by anyone who disapproved of her choices. But more than that, their parents had essentially given permission for the very arrangement Silas had proposed with such guilt and uncertainty. Catherine and Thomas McGraw had researched the laws, prepared the documents, and explicitly blessed a marriage that would protect their children, even if it shocked the world. They were leaving behind. Silas carefully refolded the letter and gathered the documents that would change everything. Marriage papers that needed only signatures and official witness. Deeds that would make them landed proprietors rather than refugees. And bank drafts that would fund their new life without requiring explanations about family relationships or the source of their wealth. But first, he had to reach Mary and get her away from the comfortable prison where she waited for men to decide her fate like livestock at auction. The rescue itself proved simpler than Silas had expected, though it required patience and the sort of woodcraft he'd learned during 5 years of mountain living. The guards watching Mary's temporary residence were good men, but frontier lawmen rather than professional soldiers, more concerned with preventing escape than repelling attack. Silas approached the building through the church graveyard, moving between tombstones with the fluid silence that had kept him alive during encounters with both wild animals and wilder men. The back window of Mary's prison faced the cemetery, separated from the nearest guard post by 50 yards of open ground that could be crossed invisible if a man knew how to move without disturbing the night. Sounds that marked him as an intruder. The window bars were exactly as Mary had described them, old iron, set in wooden frames that had been weakened by years of mountain weather. Silas worked at them with tools designed for trail repairs, but perfectly suited for quiet demolition, applying pressure in precisely the right places until the ancient wood gave way with barely audible cracks. "Mary," he whispered through the gap where one bar had been removed. "I knew you'd come," she replied, her voice carrying relief and determination in equal measure. "Did you find Mother's box?" "I found everything. Mary, we're not poor refugees anymore. We're landowners with enough money to buy respect anywhere we choose to settle." He helped her through the window with practiced efficiency. Both siblings moving with the coordination of people who'd spent years protecting each other from various forms of danger. Mary had prepared for escape with the same thorough attention she brought to every challenge, dressed for travel, carrying only essential items, ready to disappear into the night without leaving traces of where they'd gone. "The horses are waiting in the old oak grove," Silas whispered as they moved through cemetery shadows toward freedom. "Food, supplies, and everything we need to reach Father McKenna's camp before anyone realizes you're missing. And the documents. All of them. Marriage papers, property deeds, bank drafts, and Mother's letter explaining everything." His voice carried wonder at their parents' foresight. "Mary, they planned for this. They knew this day might come, and they prepared everything we'd need to claim a life worth living. They reached the horses without incident. 2 strong mounts loaded with supplies for a journey that would carry them far from the only home they'd ever known. Silas helped Mary into her saddle with the careful attention of a man who understood that everything depended on speed and stealth for the next several hours. "Once we're married, Judge Morrison's guardianship petition becomes invalid," he explained as they began the careful ride that would take them away from Cedar Ridge forever. A married woman can't be declared incompetent property of the state, especially one with independent wealth and property rights, and the inheritance. The mining operation Mother mentioned? Real, substantial, managed by partners who've been sending profits to accounts we never knew existed. Silas's voice carried amazement at the scope of their parents' secret preparations. Mary, we're not just escaping poverty and dependence. We're claiming wealth that will make us influential, members of whatever community we choose to join. The ride through mountain darkness required all of Silas's wilderness skills and Mary's hard-won ability to trust completely in guidance she couldn't see. They followed trails that existed more in memory than reality, paths that Silas had learned during hunting expeditions with their father years before. The civilization had crowded the valleys with people who measured worth by conformity to social expectations as dawn broke over peaks that had witnessed their childhood adventures. The siblings paused to rest their horses and eat a simple breakfast of trail food that tasted like freedom. Behind them, Cedar Ridge was waking to discover that Mary McGraw had vanished from her comfortable prison, taking with her any possibility that Judge Morrison's guardianship proceedings could continue. No regrets? Silas asked, studying his sister's face in the morning light. None, Mary replied without hesitation. Whatever this costs us, whatever people say about our choices, it has to be better than living as someone else's property, even if it means marriage to your own brother, even if it means lying to everyone we meet for the rest of our lives. Mary considered this, weighing the magnitude of what they were choosing against the alternatives they were rejecting. Silas, I've spent 18 years being grateful for scraps of basic human kindness. I've apologized for existing, accepted charity that came with lectures about knowing my place, and watched other women find love while I was told to be thankful for the opportunity to work for my keep. She turned toward the mountains that rose ahead of them like promises of possibilities beyond imagination. If marriage to you gives me dignity, independence, and the chance to matter to someone the way other women matter to the men who love them, then I'll learn to be the best wife you could imagine. We'll figure out what that means as we go. The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of pursuit, horses moving fast in their direction. Voices calling across the valleys as search parties began the hunt for Cedar Ridge's missing invalid. Judge Morrison had discovered Mary's escape and was mobilizing every resource at his disposal to reclaim his intended ward. Time to go, Silas said, helping Mary mount her horse with practiced efficiency. Father McKenna's camp is still 8 hours away, and we need to be married before anyone catches up with us. Married to each other, Mary said, as if testing the words aloud. Husband and wife rather than brother and sister. Partners, Silas corrected gently. Protectors of each other, companions for life, and whatever else this arrangement requires to keep us both free and safe. As they rode toward their impossible wedding, Mary found herself thinking about the strange paths that had led them to this moment. A week ago, she'd been resigned to spinsterhood or arranged marriage to men who saw her as damaged goods. Now she was racing toward a ceremony that would make her wife to the one person who'd never seen her as anything less than whole. It was shocking, unprecedented, probably immoral by conventional standards. But it was also practical, legal, and potentially liberating in ways she'd never dared to imagine. More importantly, it was their choice, made freely, with full understanding of the consequences, by two people who'd learned that love sometimes required decisions that shocked the world but saved the people who mattered most. The hidden deed rustled in Silas's saddlebags as they rode, carrying promises of land and wealth and status that would make them influential members of whatever community they chose to join. But more valuable than property or money was the simple knowledge that they would face whatever came next together, as equal partners in a marriage that belonged to them alone. Behind them, Cedar Ridge was organizing pursuit of the criminals who dared to reject community judgment about their proper place in the world. Ahead of them, Father McKenna waited with the authority to transform their desperate escape into legal marriage, that no court could dissolve or challenge. And between past and future, Mary and Silas McGraw rode toward their wedding, with the determination of people who'd finally chosen dignity over approval, freedom over security, and love over convention. Father McKenna's mining camp sprawled across a mountain meadow like a testament to human determination and divine providence. Its collection of sturdy buildings and working claims representing the sort of frontier community where questions about personal history were considered impolite and property rights carried more weight than social conventions. Mary felt her heart hammering against her ribs as they approached the camp, the reality of what they were about to do hitting her with the force of an avalanche. In less than an hour, she would be married to her own brother, joined in holy matrimony through vows that would shock their former community and bind them together for the rest of their lives. Second thoughts, Silas asked quietly, though his own tension was evident in the careful way he surveyed their surroundings for signs of pursuit or trouble. Constantly, Mary admitted, but not the kind that would change my mind. They dismounted at the camp's main building, a substantial log structure that served as both church and community center for miners who lived too far from civilization to attend regular services. The sound of their arrival brought curious faces to doorways and windows, men evaluating the newcomers with the cautious attention of people who'd learned to be careful about strangers, bearing unknown intentions. Father McKenna himself proved to be a surprise. Not the rough frontier preacher Mary had expected, but a scholarly man with intelligent eyes and the sort of quiet dignity that commanded respect without demanding it. He greeted them with polite curiosity, tinged with the wariness of someone who'd learned that unusual requests often came with unusual complications. "Mr. and Miss McGraw, I presume?" he said, consulting a note that Silas had apparently sent ahead through channels Mary didn't ask about. "You mentioned a need for immediate marriage ceremony under territorial authority." "That's correct, Father," Silas replied, his voice carrying careful respectfulness. "We're traveling to Montana territory to claim family property, and legal marriage would simplify various inheritance matters." It wasn't quite a lie, Mary realized, though it carefully avoided mentioning the family relationship that would shock even a frontier preacher accustomed to unusual circumstances. They were indeed traveling to claim family property, and marriage would indeed simplify inheritance matters by making Mary legally independent of any guardian's authority. "I see. And you have proper documentation? Birth certificates, proof of eligibility, absence of legal impediments?" Silas produced the documents their mother had prepared with such careful foresight, papers that established their identities without revealing the family connection that would make marriage impossible under conventional interpretation of church law. Father McKenna examined the documents with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to spot forgeries and fraudulent claims during years of frontier ministry. When he finished, his expression suggested satisfaction rather than suspicion. "Everything appears to be in order," he said, though Mary detected a note of professional curiosity in his voice. "Though I should mention that territorial marriage requires witnesses, at least 2 adults of good standing who can attest to the voluntary nature of the ceremony. Can you provide witnesses?" Mary asked, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the fear that this final requirement might prove impossible to meet. "Certainly. My assistants, brothers Thomas and Samuel, are ordained ministers who can serve as official witnesses. They're currently working the northern claims, but should return within the hour." Mary felt relief flood through her, followed immediately by renewed anxiety as the reality of their situation crystallized. Within an hour, she would stand before God and witnesses, promising to love, honor, and obey the brother who'd protected her since childhood. The vows would be real, the commitment binding, the consequences permanent. "Is there somewhere we might wait?" Silas asked. "Perhaps review the ceremony? Ensure we understand our obligations?" "Of course. You may use the rectory, the small cabin behind the church. I'll join you shortly to discuss the service and answer any questions you might have." The rectory proved to be a simple but comfortable space, furnished with basic necessities and a small collection of books that suggested Father McKenna was a man of broader education than his frontier circumstances might imply. Mary settled into a wooden chair beside the window, while Silas paced the small room with the restless energy of a man preparing for battle. "We need to practice," he said finally, his voice carrying the sort of careful intensity that marked him as someone working through complex problems. "If we're going to convince the witnesses this is a conventional marriage, we need to behave like people who are genuinely in love, rather than siblings making a practical arrangement." Mary absorbed this, recognizing the truth in his words, while struggling with the implications. What exactly do we need to practice? How we look at each other, how we stand together, the way we speak to each other during the ceremony. Silas stopped pacing and turned to face her with an expression she'd never seen before. "Mary, married couples have a particular intimacy in how they interact. If we're going to convince people, we need to create that intimacy convincingly. Show me," she said quietly. Rising from her chair with determination that surprised them both, Silas moved closer. Close enough that Mary could feel the warmth of his presence and smell the familiar scent of leather and pine that had always meant safety and protection. But when he looked at her, his expression carried something new, a tenderness that seemed deeper than brotherly affection. "Warmer than protective concern, like this," he said softly, his hand rising to cup her cheek with the sort of gentle reverence that spoke of romantic love rather than family connection. "Mary, you're beautiful. You're brave. You're the most remarkable woman I've ever known." The words hit her like physical blows, carrying emotional weight that made her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't the voice of her protective older brother. This was the voice of a man speaking to a woman he cherished completely. "Silas, practice," he reminded her gently. "If we're going to convince people, you need to respond like a woman who's deeply loved, rather than a sister being complimented." Mary leaned into his touch, allowing herself to feel the warmth and affection that had always existed between them, but had never been acknowledged in terms that suggested romantic possibility. I love you too," she whispered, testing the words aloud. "Say it like you mean it. Like I'm the man you've chosen to spend your life with. The person who makes you feel complete." Mary looked up into eyes that had watched over her since childhood, searched the familiar face that had been her anchor through every storm, and found herself speaking truth that surprised them both. "I love you, Silas McGraw. I choose you. I want to spend my life with you, build a future with you. Be your partner in everything that matters." The declaration hung between them like a bridge over impossible territory, carrying implications that neither had fully anticipated. Mary realized she wasn't just practicing for the witnesses. She was discovering feelings that had grown from protective affection into something deeper, more complex, potentially dangerous in its intensity. "Mary," Silas said carefully, "we need to be clear about what we're doing here. This marriage is about protection and legal standing, not what?" she interrupted quietly. "Not real feelings? Not actual partnership? Not the possibility that two people who've always cared for each other might discover they could care for each other in ways that society would find shocking, but we might find natural." Silas stared at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time, recognition dawning in his eyes like sunrise over mountain peaks. "You're not just talking about a practical arrangement anymore, are you?" Mary asked, stepping closer until only inches separated them. "And when you look at me, when you talk about protecting me and caring for me and making sure I'm never alone again, are you talking about duty to your sister or something deeper?" The question forced Silas to confront truths he'd apparently been avoiding, feelings that had grown from brotherly protection into something more complex and potentially transformative. When he answered, his voice carried the weight of revelation. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "Mary, I've spent so many years thinking about your welfare, worrying about your happiness, wanting to give you everything you deserve. I'm not sure where protective love ends and something else begins." "Then let's find out," Mary said simply. Let's get married and see what kind of partnership we can build together. If it's just practical arrangement, that's enough. If it becomes something more would be impossible, Silas said, though his voice lacked conviction. Would it? We're already planning to live together, share a home, present ourselves as husband and wife for the rest of our lives. We already care about each other, more than most married couples seem to. The only difference would be acknowledging that our feelings might be deeper than family affection. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving fast toward the camp. Through the rectory window, Mary could see dust clouds that suggested a substantial party of mounted men pushing their horses hard to cover ground quickly. "Pursuit," Silas said grimly, moving to the window to assess the threat. 6 men, maybe 7. Armed and determined, Mary felt her heart sink as she recognized the implications. Judge Morrison had organized a posse to reclaim his intended ward, and they'd tracked the fugitives to Father McKenna's camp with time to spare before the wedding ceremony could be completed. "Can we run?" she asked. "Not with fresh horses and a head start. We'd be caught within miles, and running would confirm their accusations about kidnapping and coercion. Then we fight." Silas was quiet for a moment, calculating odds that seemed impossibly stacked against them. 7 armed men against 1 with your safety to consider. "Mary, even if I could win that fight, someone would get hurt. Probably you. So what do? "We get married," Silas said decisively. "Right now, before they arrive. If you're already my wife when they get here, their guardianship petition becomes invalid regardless of what they think about our family." Relationship. Mary felt a thrill of desperate hope mixed with terror at the prospect of exchanging vows while armed men rode toward them with intentions that probably included violence. "Will Father McKenna agree to perform the ceremony under these circumstances?" "He'll agree if we pay him enough and explain that we're being pursued by people who want to prevent a legal marriage for their own purposes." Silas was already moving toward the door. "Mary, are you certain about this? Once we take these vows, there's no going back. No annulment. No pretending it was just a practical arrangement if we change our minds later." Mary looked out the window at the approaching dust clouds, then at the man who'd spent his life protecting her and was now offering her partnership that could save them both or damn them beyond redemption. "I'm certain," she said quietly. "Let's get married, Silas McGraw. Let's claim the life our parents prepared for us and face whatever comes next as husband and wife." They found Father McKenna in the church, preparing for evening services with the methodical attention of a man who took his duties seriously. He looked up as they entered, noting their obvious urgency and the tense way Silas kept glancing toward the windows. "Father," Silas said without preamble, "we need to be married immediately. We're being pursued by people who want to prevent our union for reasons that have nothing to do with legitimate legal objections." Father McKenna studied them with intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than they were saying. "What sort of people? And what sort of objections?" "Community leaders who disapprove of our choice to leave their jurisdiction," Mary said, which was technically true while avoiding details that might complicate matters. "They've organized pursuit to force me to return for guardianship proceedings that would strip me of the right to marry anyone without court approval." "I see." Father McKenna glanced toward the window, where the approaching riders were now visible as individual men rather than distant dust clouds. "And you believe marriage would resolve these difficulties?" "A married woman can't be declared incompetent property of the state," Silas replied. "Legal marriage would establish Mary's independence and make any guardianship proceedings invalid." Father McKenna nodded thoughtfully, apparently recognizing the legal realities involved while choosing not to examine the family relationship that might complicate matters under other circumstances. "Brothers Thomas and Samuel have returned from the northern claims," he said finally. "We can perform the ceremony immediately if you're prepared to exchange vows in somewhat hurried circumstances." "We're prepared," Mary said, her voice carrying determination that surprised even her. "Then let us proceed quickly. I suspect our visitors will arrive shortly, and married couples are much more difficult." to separate than unmarried individuals with questionable legal status. As Father McKenna gathered his ceremonial materials and called for his assistant ministers to serve as witnesses, Mary felt the loaded pistol at Silas's belt pressing against her side, a reminder that their wedding ceremony might be interrupted by violence, that their vows might be exchanged under threat of gunfire, that their new life together might begin with bloodshed. But she also felt her mother's wedding ring warm in her hand. The simple gold band that had witnessed 23 years of partnership built on love and mutual protection. If Catherine and Thomas McGraw could build a marriage that lasted until death separated them, perhaps their children could build something equally strong from the bonds that had already sustained them. Through every trial, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder as Judge Morrison's posse approached the camp, their voices carrying across the mountain air with the authority of men accustomed to having their demands met without question. "Quickly now," Father McKenna said, opening his prayer book to the marriage ceremony. "Let us join these two in holy matrimony before anyone can object to what God has chosen to bless." The wedding ceremony began, with the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoing through the mountain valley like distant thunder, each moment bringing Judge Morrison's posse closer to a confrontation that would either validate Mary and Silas's desperate gamble or destroy their last hope of freedom. Father McKenna stood before the simple wooden altar with his prayer book open, flanked by brothers Thomas and Samuel, who served as both witnesses and protection against any interruption that might prevent the completion of legal vows. The afternoon light streaming through the church windows caught their mother's lace veil as Mary arranged it over her hair, the delicate fabric that had blessed Catherine McGraw's wedding, now consecrating a union that would have shocked the very community that had shaped their childhood. "Dearly beloved," Father McKenna began, his voice carrying solemn authority despite the urgency of their circumstances. "We are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Mary felt Silas's hand close around hers, warm and steady despite the tension that radiated from him like heat from a forge. He stood beside her in the simple black suit that had belonged to their father, transformed from the mountain man who'd rescued her into someone who could pass for a respectable frontier gentleman claiming his bride. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," Father McKenna continued, "but reverently, advisedly, and in the fear of God. If any person knows of any impediment why these two should not be joined in marriage, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." The momentary silence that followed was filled with the sound of horses entering the camp outside, voices calling with official authority as Judge Morrison's posse announced their arrival and demanded answers about the fugitives they'd been tracking across mountain wilderness. "Then let us proceed," Father McKenna said quickly, recognizing that time was running out for the ceremony he'd agreed to perform. "Silas McGraw, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do," Silas replied, his voice carrying absolute certainty, despite the impossibility of what they were promising each other. "Mary McGraw, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love, honor, and cherish in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Mary looked up into eyes that had protected her since childhood, searched the familiar face that was becoming something new and precious in the afternoon light, and spoke the words that would transform them both forever. "I do." The simple declaration carried weight that seemed to fill the church with possibilities neither had dared to imagine until this moment. Mary McGraw was choosing to become Mary McGraw, wife to the brother who'd never seen her as anything less than whole, partner to the man who'd offered her dignity when the world had offered only charity. "The rings," Father McKenna prompted gently. Silas reached into his vest pocket and withdrew the simple gold band that had belonged to their mother, the ring that had witnessed 23 years of partnership built on love and mutual protection. His hands were steady as he took Mary's left hand, but she could feel the tremor of emotion as he spoke the words that would bind them legally and spiritually. "With this ring I thee wed, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." The ring slipped onto Mary's finger with the weight of permanence, transforming her from ward to wife in the space of heartbeats. She felt the gold warm against her skin, carrying the blessing of parents who'd prepared for this moment even as they'd hoped it would never be necessary. Outside, the voices were growing louder, more demanding. Judge Morrison was questioning the camp's residents about strangers who might have arrived seeking shelter or assistance. It would be only minutes before the search reached the church, where impossible vows were being exchanged. Mary reached for the second ring Silas had prepared, a simple band that matched her own, chosen to suggest long-established partnership rather than hasty convenience. Her hands trembled slightly as she took his left hand, but her voice was steady as she repeated the ancient promise. "With this ring I thee wed, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, by the power vested in me by the territorial authority of this jurisdiction," Father McKenna said quickly, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The words hung in the afternoon air like a benediction and a challenge, transforming two siblings into a married couple with legal standing that no court could easily dissolve. Mary felt the magnitude of what they'd accomplished settling over her like her mother's veil, protective, precious, and probably shocking to anyone who knew their history. "You may kiss the bride," Father McKenna added with gentle humor that suggested he understood the complexity of what he'd just witnessed. Mary turned toward her new husband with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation, recognizing that this moment would mark their transformation from siblings making a practical arrangement to married partners claiming an intimate bond. Silas cupped her face with the same gentle reverence he'd shown during their practice. But when his lips touched hers, the kiss carried weight that surprised them both. It was gentle, respectful, appropriate for a church ceremony, but it was also real, carrying emotional depth that spoke of genuine affection rather than performed obligation. Mary found herself responding with warmth that had nothing to do with acting and everything to do with the man who'd chosen to protect her by making her his wife. When they separated, Silas's eyes held wonder that suggested he was experiencing the same unexpected depth of feeling. Whatever they'd thought they were creating through practical arrangement, the reality was proving more complex and potentially transformative than either had anticipated. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. McGraw," Father McKenna said warmly. "May your union be blessed with happiness, prosperity, and the strength to weather whatever storms may come." Brothers Thomas and Samuel stepped forward to sign the marriage certificate as official witnesses, their signatures legally validating a union that would shock Cedar Ridge and protect Mary from Judge Morrison's guardianship proceedings. The document rustled importantly as Father McKenna added his own signature, transforming their desperate gamble into legal reality. "Thank you, Father," Mary said quietly, her voice carrying gratitude that encompassed more than just the ceremony itself. "You've given us more than marriage. You've given us freedom. Marriage should always bring freedom." Father McKenna replied with the wisdom of a man who'd blessed unions built on every foundation, from passionate love to practical necessity. "The freedom to build a life together on your own terms, according to your own values, without answering to anyone who hasn't earned the right to judge your choices." The sound of boots on the church steps interrupted their moment of gratitude, accompanied by voices that carried official authority backed by weapons and determination. Judge Morrison had found them. Father McKenna came the call from outside. "We need to speak with you about fugitives you may be harboring. We're here on official business regarding the welfare of a young woman who's been kidnapped from proper guardianship." Mary felt Silas tense beside her, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol. at his belt before stopping as he remembered they were in a church, surrounded by witnesses who would testify about any violence that occurred. "Steady," he murmured quietly. "We're married now, Mary, legal husband and wife. Whatever they say, whatever they threaten, they can't change that." Father McKenna moved toward the church door with the calm dignity of a man accustomed to dealing with various forms of frontier conflict. "Gentlemen," he called out, "you're welcome to enter if your business is lawful and conducted with appropriate respect for this house of worship." The doors opened to admit Judge Morrison, Sheriff Coleman, and 4 armed men whose presence suggested they'd come prepared for resistance rather than negotiation. Morrison's eyes swept the church interior, taking inventory of what he saw before focusing on Mary with the satisfied expression of a man who'd successfully tracked down escaped property. "Miss McGraw," he said with false gentleness, "we've come to escort you back to proper care. Your guardianship proceedings are scheduled to continue, and your absence has caused considerable concern about your welfare." "I'm afraid there's been some confusion," Mary replied with quiet dignity, rising from her seat beside the altar with the fluid grace of a woman who'd learned to move confidently despite her disability. "I'm no longer Miss McGraw." She lifted her left hand to display the wedding ring that caught the afternoon light like captured starfire, the simple gold band that marked her transformation from ward to wife. "I'm Mrs. Silas McGraw, legally married under territorial authority just minutes ago." "Which makes your guardianship proceedings invalid, as married women cannot be declared incompetent property of the state." The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of legal reality that none of Morrison's preparations had anticipated. He'd organized pursuit to reclaim an unmarried woman who could be forced into guardianship he hadn't prepared to face. A wife with independent legal standing that no court could easily challenge. "Impossible," he said finally. "The marriage, it's not legal, not valid." The marriage was performed by ordained minister under proper territorial authority," Father McKenna interrupted mildly. "Brothers Thomas and Samuel served as official witnesses. All documentation has been properly completed, and the union has been duly consecrated according to law and church doctrine. But there—" Morrison stopped himself before completing the accusation that would reveal how much he knew about the McGraw family relationships. To challenge the marriage on grounds of consanguinity, he would have to admit he'd been pursuing siblings rather than an unrelated man kidnapping a vulnerable woman. "They're what?" Father McKenna asked with polite curiosity. "Legally married adults who chose to unite their lives according to their own judgment rather than community pressure. I failed to see any impediment that would invalidate their union." Sheriff Coleman stepped forward with obvious discomfort, recognizing that the legal situation had shifted in ways that complicated his authority. "Father, we have reports that this woman was taken against her will, that she's being coerced." "Sheriff," Mary interrupted quietly, "I'm perfectly capable of speaking for myself. I chose to marry Silas McGraw of my own free will, without coercion or duress. We're legal husband and wife, bound by vows that no earthly authority can dissolve. The court will determine—" Morrison began angrily. "The court will determine nothing," Mary replied with steel in her voice that surprised everyone present. "I'm a married woman with independent legal standing, property rights, and the protection of territorial law. Your guardianship petition has no authority over someone who's already chosen her own guardian." The tension in the small church reached a breaking point as Judge Morrison realized his carefully orchestrated legal maneuvering had been outplayed by 2 people he'd dismissed as manageable problems. His face darkened with the rage of a man accustomed to having his authority respected without question, and Mary could see him calculating options that might include violence despite the sacred setting. "This marriage is a fraud," Morrison declared, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent years having his pronouncements accepted as law. A desperate attempt to circumvent legitimate legal proceedings designed to protect a vulnerable woman from exploitation. "The marriage is legal and binding," Father McKenna replied calmly, though Mary noticed his subtle positioning that would allow him to shield the newly married couple if the confrontation turned violent. Performed according to territorial law by ordained minister with proper witnesses and complete documentation. Documentation that fails to disclose the true relationship between these people. Morrison snarled, apparently deciding that revealing the family connection was worth the risk if it invalidated their protection. The accusation hung in the church air like smoke from a dying fire, carrying implications that could destroy everything Mary and Silas had risked to achieve. Mary felt her heart stop as she realized Morrison was prepared to expose their secret, to shock Father McKenna and his witnesses with the truth that would make their marriage scandalous even by frontier standards. What relationship? Father McKenna asked with polite curiosity. Mr. and Mrs. McGraw presented proper identification and documentation showing no legal impediments to marriage. Are you suggesting they provided false information? Morrison hesitated, recognizing the trap in Father McKenna's question. To challenge the marriage on grounds of consanguinity, he would have to explain how he knew about the family relationship, which would require admitting he'd been pursuing siblings rather than an unrelated kidnapper and his victim. Morrison began, then stopped as he apparently realized the implications of what he was about to reveal. Their what? Silas asked quietly, rising from his seat beside Mary, with the fluid grace that marked him as dangerous despite the peaceful setting. Legally married adults who chose to unite their lives according to their own judgment. Citizens with the right to travel freely and settle wherever they choose. Property owners with legitimate business in Montana Territory. The mention of property rights caused a visible shift in the confrontation's dynamics. Sheriff Coleman exchanged glances with his deputies, recognizing that pursuing wealthy landowners was different from chasing refugees with questionable legal status. Property owners? Coleman asked carefully. Mary reached into her traveling bag and withdrew. The deed that had transformed everything, the document that proved the McGraw family was far more than the struggling homesteaders they'd appeared to be. The expensive parchment rustled impressively as she unfolded it for the assembled men to examine. 5,000 acres in Montana Territory, she said quietly. Water rights to 3 river systems, mineral rights to proven silver deposits, and a mining operation that's been generating substantial income for over 15 years. The revelation hit the pursuing party like a physical blow, forcing them to confront the reality that they weren't dealing with desperate refugees, but with wealthy landowners who could afford lawyers, political influence, and whatever else might be required to protect their interests. Impossible, Morrison breathed, though his voice lacked the conviction of his earlier pronouncements. Thomas McGraw was a simple farmer. Thomas McGraw was a man who planned carefully for his children's future, Silas interrupted, including provisions for circumstances that required them to start over somewhere new. Mary watched Morrison's face as understanding dawned, the recognition that his guardianship proceedings had been designed to gain control over a woman with substantial independent wealth, not a penniless invalid dependent on community charity. The legal implications were staggering, transforming his actions from paternalistic concern into something approaching attempted theft. Furthermore, Mary continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally recognized her own power. As a married woman with independent property rights, I'm legally entitled to prosecute anyone who attempts to interfere with my freedom or property through fraudulent guardianship proceedings. The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Pursue this matter further and face legal consequences that could destroy Morrison's reputation and career. A wealthy landowner with proper documentation and territorial connections was not someone who could be bullied with impunity. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward with obvious reluctance, recognizing that his authority was insufficient to challenge the legal realities Mary had presented. Mrs. McGraw, if you're certain this marriage was entered into freely— Sheriff, Mary interrupted gently, I'm a grown woman who's been managing my own affairs for 5 years. I chose to marry Silas McGraw because he's the only man who's ever treated me as an equal partner rather than charity goods to be managed. But the guardianship petition, Morrison protested desperately, is invalid, Father McKenna observed mildly. Married women with independent property rights cannot be declared incompetent wards of the state, especially when there's no evidence of mental incapacity or coercion. The legal reality was settling over the confrontation like winter snow, transforming Morrison's confident authority into increasingly desperate maneuvering. He'd organized pursuit to reclaim a vulnerable woman who could be forced into guardianship. Instead, he'd found a married landowner with the legal standing to defend herself and the wealth to make such defense effective. "This isn't over," Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the impotent rage of a man who'd been outmaneuvered by people he'd dismissed as manageable problems. "The court will review these circumstances, investigate the legitimacy of this marriage. The court will find that everything was conducted according to law," Mary replied with quiet certainty. "Unless you're prepared to explain to territorial authorities why you were pursuing wealthy landowners with fraudulent guardianship, proceedings designed to gain control of their property." The counter-threat hit its mark, forcing Morrison to confront the reality that his actions could be interpreted as attempted theft rather than paternalistic concern. Pursuing the matter further would require explaining motivations that might not survive legal scrutiny. "We're leaving," Sheriff Coleman announced, apparently deciding that discretion was preferable to a legal battle with uncertain outcomes. "Mrs. McGraw, if you ever need assistance or protection, she has protection," Silas said quietly, his hand resting on the pistol at his belt with casual ease that suggested absolute confidence in his ability to use it effectively. "She has a husband who understands his obligations." The pursuing party left with promises of future investigation and warnings about the consequences of fraudulent documentation, but their threats lacked the conviction of their earlier authority. They'd come expecting to reclaim escaped property. Instead, they'd encountered legal reality that transformed their pursuit into potential criminal activity. When the last echo of their horses faded across the mountain valley, Mary and Silas found themselves alone in the church with Father McKenna and his witnesses. Officially married and legally protected, but facing an uncertain future built on foundations that would shock anyone who learned the truth about their relationship. "Well," Father McKenna said quietly, "that was considerably more excitement than our usual wedding ceremonies provide." "I'm sorry we brought trouble to your camp," Mary said, though she felt no real regret about the confrontation that had established their legal standing beyond challenge. "No trouble at all. I've performed marriages under various circumstances over the years. Young couples fleeing disapproving families, widows seeking companionship, even political unions designed to settle property disputes. Love takes many forms, and the Church's role is to bless whatever forms provide mutual protection and genuine care." Mary felt tears threaten at the understanding in Father McKenna's words, recognizing that he'd somehow grasped the truth about their unusual marriage without requiring explanations that would shock conventional sensibilities. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For seeing us as people deserving of dignity rather than problems to be solved." "Marriage should always be about dignity," Father McKenna replied gently. "The dignity of choosing your own path, building your own life, protecting the people who matter most to you." As the afternoon sun painted the church windows in shades of gold and amber, Mary and Silas McGraw stood together as husband and wife, bound by vows that would either save them both or damn them beyond redemption. The confrontation with Judge Morrison had established their legal standing, but the real test would come in learning to live as married partners rather than protective siblings. "Ready to start our new life?" Silas asked quietly, offering his arm with the formal courtesy of a husband escorting his wife. "Ready," Mary replied. accepting his support while recognizing that everything familiar was ending and everything possible was beginning. Behind them lay Cedar Ridge and the community that had shaped their childhood, but never accepted their worth. Ahead lay Montana Territory and the chance to build a life on their own terms, using wealth their parents had hidden and legal standing they'd claimed through the most shocking wedding ceremony in territorial history, the burning cross that had marked their final confrontation with Judge Morrison's authority, was just visible through the church windows, a symbol of the community's ultimate rejection, but also of their own triumph over prejudice and persecution. They'd chosen each other over social approval, dignity over safety, and love over convention. Now they had to learn what it meant to be husband and wife rather than brother and sister, to build a partnership that could withstand scrutiny while protecting the bond that had always sustained them both. 6 months later, Mary McGraw stood in the doorway of the substantial house that had risen from Montana wilderness through her husband's labor and their shared vision of what a home should be. The morning sun painted the valley in shades of gold and green, illuminating the thriving settlement that had grown around their property as other families sought the prosperity and acceptance they'd found in this remote corner of territorial freedom. The new home deed lay on the kitchen table beside letters from the bank confirming that their mining operation had generated enough profit to fund not just their own comfort, but investments in the growing community around them. Samuel Crawford, their father's former partner, had proved to be an honest manager who'd surrendered control of the operation with grace and gratitude for the opportunity to continue working claims that had made them all wealthy. Mrs. McGraw called out. Sarah Jensen, the young woman who helped with household management and had become Mary's closest friend in their new community. The delegation from town is approaching. They'll be here within the hour. Mary nodded with calm satisfaction, smoothing the elegant dress that marked her transformation from charity case to respected community leader. Today's meeting would finalize negotiations for the new church and school that her family's donations would fund, establishing institutions that would serve the growing population, attracted by mining prosperity and territorial opportunity. "Is my husband ready?" she asked, though she could hear Silas moving around upstairs with the confident efficiency of a man preparing for important business. "Mr. McGraw is reviewing the final contracts," Sarah replied. He wanted to ensure every detail was correct before meeting with the territorial representatives. Mary smiled at the formal way Sarah referred to them, recognizing how completely they'd established themselves as a respectable married couple in a community that valued results over personal history. No one questioned their relationship, their right to control substantial property, or their authority to make decisions that affected the entire region's development. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the window, where she could see the delegation that had ridden from the territorial capital to finalize agreements that would transform their remote valley into an official town, with all the legal protections and commercial opportunities that implied. 6 months of marriage had taught Mary and Silas to move together with the natural coordination of genuine partners, reading each other's needs and responding with the sort of intimate understanding that marked successful unions. They'd learned to be husband and wife in every observable way, creating a relationship that appeared conventional while being built on foundations no one could imagine. Silas appeared in the doorway, dressed in the fine clothing that marked him as a successful businessman rather than the mountain man who'd rescued her from Judge Morrison's guardianship proceedings. The transformation was remarkable, from dangerous savage to respected community leader through nothing more than wealth, legal standing, and the confidence that came from being valued rather than feared. "Ready for this?" he asked, offering his arm with the casual intimacy that had become natural between them. "More than ready," Mary replied. accepting his support while recognizing how far they'd both traveled from the desperate siblings who'd fled Cedar Ridge under cover of darkness. The delegation proved to include territorial officials, potential investors, and representatives from other communities who wanted to understand the success that had transformed their valley from wilderness into prosperity. Mary greeted them with the gracious authority of a woman accustomed to being taken seriously, her disability no longer marking her as damaged goods, but simply another aspect of the remarkable woman who'd helped build something valuable from nothing. "Mrs. McGraw," said Territorial Representative Harrison, consulting documents that rustled with official importance. "Your proposals for civic development have been reviewed and approved by the territorial legislature. The funding for church construction, school establishment, and road improvement will be managed through the bank accounts you've established for community development." "Excellent," Mary replied with satisfaction. "My husband and I believe that prosperity should benefit everyone, not just the people fortunate enough to discover silver deposits." The negotiations that followed established their valley as an official territorial town with Mary and Silas McGraw, recognized as founding citizens whose authority derived from property ownership, community investment, and the sort of civic leadership that territorial governments actively encouraged. During a break in the formal proceedings, Representative Harrison approached Mary privately with the sort of careful respect that suggested he understood he was dealing with someone whose influence extended beyond their remote valley. "Mrs. McGraw, if I may ask, there have been inquiries from Colorado Territory about your family's background. Nothing official, but questions about previous residences and family connections." Mary felt a brief flutter of old fear before recognizing that she was no longer the vulnerable woman who'd fled Judge Morrison's authority. She was a wealthy landowner with legal standing, political connections, and the protection of territorial law. "What sort of inquiries?" she asked calmly. "General background investigations, probably connected to your mining investments and community development projects. Wealthy families often attract attention from people hoping to discover useful connections or potential vulnerabilities." "I see. And what have these investigations discovered?" "That you and your husband are exactly what you appear to be, successful property owners with legitimate business interests and a remarkable talent for community development. Your background is exemplary, your financial standing is solid, and your civic contributions have been noted at the highest levels of territorial government." Mary absorbed this information with relief that was tinged with amusement at how completely they'd transformed themselves from desperate refugees to respected citizens. Their success had created its own legitimacy, making their past irrelevant compared to their present achievements. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," she said quietly. "My husband and I value our privacy, but we have nothing to hide about our business dealings or community involvement. Of course, I simply wanted you to know that your reputation extends far beyond this valley. There's talk of territorial appointment to development commissions, possibly even consideration for positions when Montana achieves statehood." The conversation was interrupted by Silas's approach, moving with the confident ease of a man comfortable in his role as successful businessman and community leader. 6 months of marriage had taught him to read Mary's expressions, and he apparently recognized that she'd received news requiring discussion. "Representative Harrison," he said warmly, shaking hands with the sort of firm grip that marked him as someone worth knowing. "I trust everything is proceeding smoothly with our development proposals?" "Very smoothly, Mr. McGraw. Your wife was just mentioning that your reputation for civic leadership has attracted attention at the territorial level. We may have additional opportunities to discuss in the future." After the delegation departed, with promises of continued cooperation and hints about future political possibilities, Mary and Silas found themselves alone in the house that had become the center of their new life. The formal entertaining was over, the business concluded, and they could finally relax into the private partnership that sustained their public success. Political opportunities? Silas asked, settling into the chair beside hers with the easy familiarity of genuine companionship. Territorial appointments, development commissions, possibly even consideration for positions when Montana achieves statehood. Mary reached for his hand with the natural gesture that had become second nature over months of learning to be married. They see us as exactly what we appear to be, successful citizens whose judgment can be trusted with important responsibilities. No questions about our background. Our family connections? None that matter. Our success has created its own legitimacy. Whatever we were before, we're now the McGraw family, landowners, community leaders, and respected citizens whose past is less important than our present achievements. Silas lifted their joined hands to study the wedding rings that had marked their transformation from siblings to spouses, simple gold bands that carried the weight of impossible choices and unexpected success. Any regrets? He asked quietly. About the choices we made, the life we've built together? Mary considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved, weighing what they'd gained against what they'd lost through their desperate gamble on an impossible marriage. They'd left behind everything familiar, community, friends, the simple certainty of conventional relationships. But they'd gained freedom, prosperity, and partnership that had proved more fulfilling than either had dared to imagine. None, she said finally. Silas, we've built something remarkable here. A marriage that works, a community that values us, a life that doesn't require either of us to apologize for existing. Even though we're living a lie? Even though no one knows the truth about who we really are? Mary smiled at the complexity of questions that had no simple answers. Are we living a lie? We're legally married, genuinely committed to each other's welfare, and building a partnership that's stronger than most conventional marriages we've observed. The only lie is letting people assume we met and fell in love in traditional ways, and that doesn't bother you. Never being able to tell the complete truth about our relationship. The complete truth is that we're two people who've always cared for each other, who chose to formalize that care through legal marriage when circumstances required it, and who've discovered that partnership can take forms more complex and satisfying than either of us expected. Mary rose from her chair and moved to the window that looked out over the valley they'd claimed as home, watching the sun set over mountains that had witnessed their transformation from desperate refugees to respected citizens. We saved each other. Silas, you saved me from becoming Judge Morrison's legal property, and I saved you from a lifetime of guilt about failing to protect me. We've built a life that honors our parents' memory and uses the gifts they left us to create something valuable for other people. Silas joined her at the window, his arm settling around her waist with the casual intimacy that had become natural between them. And we've learned that love really can take forms too radical for the world to understand. Have we learned that? Mary asked quietly. That what we have is actually love rather than just protective partnership? The question hung between them, like a bridge over territory they'd been carefully avoiding, acknowledging feelings that had grown from family affection into something deeper and more complex than either had expected when they'd exchanged desperate vows in Father McKenna's church. I think, Silas said carefully, we've learned that the difference might not matter as much as we thought it would. We care for each other completely, we've committed to each other permanently, and we've built a partnership that satisfies us both. Whether that's love or something else, it's enough, Mary finished softly. Whatever we call it, whatever people would think if they knew the truth, it's enough. They stood together in the gathering dusk, watching their valley settle into the peaceful rhythms of evening, while their minds wandered over the strange path that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, Mary had been resigned to spinsterhood or arranged marriage to men who saw her as damaged goods. Silas had been a mountain hermit, consumed by guilt over abandoning his sister to face the world's cruelties alone. Now they were respected community leaders with wealth, influence, and the security of legal partnership that no one could challenge or dissolve. They'd found acceptance in a place where results mattered more than personal history, prosperity more than social convention, and civic contribution more than family relationships that might shock conventional sensibilities. "What do you suppose our parents would think?" Mary asked, thinking about Catherine and Thomas McGraw and the careful provisions they'd made for circumstances too shocking to discuss openly. "I think they'd be proud," Silas replied without hesitation. "We used the gifts they left us to build something valuable. We protected each other when protection was needed. We chose dignity over approval and freedom over security. That's exactly what they prepared us to do, even the marriage part, even the choice to become husband and wife rather than remain brother and sister, especially that part. Mother's letter made it clear she understood what this choice might cost us and what it might give us. She blessed it in advance, because she knew that love sometimes requires decisions that shock the world but save the people who matter most. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Mary and Silas McGraw stood together in the home they'd built from wilderness and impossibility, secure in the knowledge that they'd claimed a life worth living through choices that had required everything they possessed of courage, determination, and faith in each other. They'd left behind the names and identities that had shaped their childhood, transforming themselves from the McGraw siblings into the McGraw couple through legal marriage and territorial relocation. But they'd carried forward the bond that had always sustained them, protective, love that had learned to take forms radical enough to ensure their survival and conventional enough to earn their community's respect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities as their influence expanded beyond their valley into territorial politics and statehood negotiations. But tonight belonged to them alone, husband and wife, partners and protectors, two people who discovered that family loyalty could become the foundation for marriage that shocked the world while satisfying everyone involved. The deed to their new home rustled in the evening breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, marking their transformation from desperate refugees to founding citizens of a community that valued what they'd built together. More than questions about how they'd come to build it, Mary McGraw rested her head against her husband's shoulder and watched the stars appear over the valley that had become their refuge and their kingdom, grateful for impossible choices that had led to improbable happiness, and certain that whatever the future held, they would face it together as equal partners in a marriage that belonged to them alone.